The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 141 Mobilizing Forces. The reward of a new hidden realm was extremely enticing to every party present. The potential of a reward, the Innkeeper said, was even more valuable, directly affected everyone's plans. The lazy sloth that originally could not be bothered at all with the midnight games suddenly returned to Nibiru and, for the first time, made his presence known worldwide. There was no drowsiness in his eyes as he flew over the various continents of the planet, scanning all beings with his spiritual senses. Just getting the strongest beasts at the foundation and golden core would not work. He needed the proper cohesiveness of an army, or at least various smaller units, who could work together. Originally, he had planned to use this time to evaluate the beasts from Earth and Vegas Minima, very few of whom had actually arrived. Now he had just met them, flashed them with his cultivation level, and told them that he would meet with them once the next event finally began. If they waited for him, they might receive some benefits. If not, Golden Hair no longer cared as much. Green's Haven was also mobilizing his subordinates, while Blood Fang, who had already prepared to fight, was directly informed by the sloth that he would be taking command. At first the wolf was dissatisfied, as even though the sloth was stronger, it did not mean the wolf was a coward and would easily hand over command of its forces. Yet the sloth pacified the wolf easily by guiding it on how it could further transform its inferior Lycao's bloodline, something that it had been trying to do its whole life. Since the reward would be shared by the whole planet instead of an individual, Blood Fang decided to temporarily give the sloth control of its various forces. The Earthlings' reaction was just as substantial. Immediately, the 5 nascents called a meeting and started discussing their plans. There were multiple things they needed to take into account when deciding their actions. Their first priority was Earth. Despite their best efforts to negotiate with the rebels, their efforts remained unrewarded. They needed to leave enough forces on Earth to protect their interests, which, unfortunately, meant it was impossible for them to send an army of 5,000 golden core cultivators to fight. This was especially so since, on Earth, golden core cultivators were no longer considered soldiers and were at the very top level of each force. With such a glaring disadvantage, they directly decided to forego trying to win the combat portion of the games. They would instead negotiate with the Jotun Empire and try to gain the greatest advantages they could in exchange for helping the Empire attain victory. This in itself would not be an easy feat, as their relationship with the Empire had undergone an undesirable change. They were not able to accept Ragnar's deal of recruiting 1.5 million people unless the Inn acted as a conduit for transporting them, nor were they willing to give up Earth's location. The fallout from that was not as bad as they expected. When they informed Anthony of their decision, he seemed to have expected as much. The real difficulty was then in deciding what further benefits they could gain from one another. Anthony was in no way as flexible as Ragnar had been during their meeting and maintained a superior stance throughout every subsequent meeting they had. Though he did not explicitly say so, his actions strongly let them know that they had nothing to give to the Empire outside of their performance during the games. Now, with such a prize up for grabs, the Earthlings' support became more valuable. The families decided amongst themselves what exactly they wanted and how much they were willing to contribute. It went without saying that most of them wanted resources to promote their nascent cultivation. Only Fade and Brandon decided to put the needs of their families first. With the decision made, the 5 of them went to find Anthony and begin a new round of negotiations. The soldiers from the Empire had the mildest reaction. This wasn't because they did not want the award, on the contrary, the award was extremely important to them. Access to a hidden realm could provide them with precious resources that would aid them in their conquest, even on the other 2 Vegas planets. Even though the Empire itself was immeasurably rich, distant waters could not put out nearby fires. No, the soldiers had the mildest reaction because they had planned on doing their best from the very get-go. Tens of thousands of their soldiers were already on standby, awaiting their orders. The games wouldn't even be that different from their normal jobs, as they were tasked with killing zombies anyway. Gathering up Foundation Realm soldiers had been a slight, emphasis on slight, problem for them. This was because Foundation Realm was actually too low a level for them to be considered active service soldiers. Their proper designation was trainee soldiers. But even as trainees, they were strong enough to outclass most others at their level. For the Empire, this was slightly akin to asking high school level kids to undertake a dangerous yet important task. The difference being these high school kids were heavily trained for the task. There was no doubt that to an imaginative mind, such a situation would be akin to an integral story arc for one of those high school kids that would actually be the main character of a novel. Maybe some of those trainees even thought of themselves as such. Only time would tell what their results were. As soon as the details for the games were announced, in a calm and orderly fashion orders were passed out, and before the Earthlings even arrived to ask for a meeting, 10,000 fully geared soldiers appeared at the inn. The sight of 5,000 peak Golden Core soldiers and 5,000 peak Foundation Realm soldiers was extraordinary. They exuded a battle-hardened aura and their expressions were thirsty for combat. The 5 Earthlings, though not unexposed to massive armies, stopped where they stood and stared in awe at the sight. Their battle intent was reined in, to not offend the Innkeeper, yet just their visage was enough to send shivers down the Earthlings' spines. Their confidence in negotiating diminished a bit, as it truly did not seem like the Empire would need any help. While all this was going on, the devils did not remain idle either. The mysterious man and Loretta continued to sit in the room, as they had long since already given out their orders. The 2 remaining devils did not know that Loretta was still here, but even if they did, it would not matter. They were quite looking forward to seeing the Empire's reactions once they were done. Azure, the devil with the saber-tooth fangs, summoned his personal assistant. Looking at a mini version of himself, he said, "There is an important matter we need to discuss with the Innkeeper. Is it possible for us to meet with him? I can pass along a message to the Innkeeper. What shall I say it is about?" "Why, our participation in the Midnight Games, of course," he replied, giving a toothy grin. The devil was trying to look sincere, but his giant fangs and sharp teeth made him look menacing instead. "I will pass along the message. Please wait," the hologram said, and disappeared. Lex, who was observing the various reactions everyone was having, was fairly surprised to learn that someone was asking for an audience with him. When he learned the request was from the 2 devils, he frowned a bit. He supposed it was too much to hope that they wouldn't create any trouble when he was so openly targeting them. "You wanted to see me?" he asked with a warm smile, appearing before the 2. "My most sincere apologies for disturbing you, Innkeeper," said Creel, his dark eyes trained on Lex. "But I just had a small question. I thought it would be best to ask you, instead of making my own assumptions." "There is no need for apologies. Ask away." "Since only 5,000 participants are allowed by each planet, when we bring forth our participants, how will it be decided whether our participants enter or the humans? This is not really an issue we can hash out with the humans on Vegas Minima. They don't really seem amenable to our cause." It was a good thing that Lex was wearing the host attire suit, because otherwise his eyes would have been stretched open when he realized the glaring flaw in his plan for the games. The planet Vegas Minima was shared by the devils and the humans, and so both would technically be allowed to bring forth participants. The rules of the event set by him dictated it be so, and the system would not allow him to prevent them from participating, since they represented the planet as well. Lex sighed internally as he quickly thought of solutions. Chapter 142 Half. Lex's brain went into overdrive. Within less than a single second, he tried to find various solutions. He tried blocking the devils from entering, simply because it was the easiest solution. Yet before he began the event, he had to decide on its rules and format. Everything that happened was based on those rules. Let alone Lex, even the system could not randomly change the rules once the event had started. Since the parameters of anyone from that planet had been defined, albeit a loose definition, Lex could do nothing to prevent their participation. As a developer himself, Lex understood the logic behind it. Often a client would ask him to simply remove something or to create a magic button that simply performed a certain action. Yet, as simple as these requests sounded conceptually, the complexity behind even the tiniest of details was not to be underestimated. Then Lex tried to identify them as a separate entity and give them a separate quota of soldiers, but that didn't work either. He tried adding them as a part of the original zombies that were defending the node, but it could not work. He tried a dozen other solutions, but none of them bore fruit. Eventually, Lex was only left with one option that Lex had wanted to avoid. After checking if his last solution would work, Lex looked at Creel and said, "I thought the answer was fairly obvious. But I guess it was an oversight of mine, considering the kind of relationship you have with each other. Since you both share the planet, you can fill half the quota for participants each. If you two can come to a compromise on your own, then you can decide the split, otherwise each will get exactly 50%. Creel grinned at the answer. Truthfully, the devils knew that the moment the nodes underwent any interference, fluctuations in their protection formation would give away their location. It was only a matter of time before the devils lost control of Vegas Minima because, to them, it was only another farm. They weren't putting any serious effort into protecting it. But at the same time, there was no reason to make it too easy for the humans to reclaim their planet. "That is splendid," the devil answered. "We will begin preparations immediately." "Good luck," Lex said, and teleported away. He felt a little bad for the Jotuns, but he was literally the one that said participants could sabotage one another. When he said that, he simply thought that the planets would at most steal from each other to deprive points, since it was still in their best interest to destroy the nodes. Yet now, there was another element of complexity to the games. The previous favorites to win, the Jotun Empire, were suddenly at a great disadvantage. The beasts might have the greatest chances of winning now. At the same time, all three of them were at a greater disadvantage now as well. I suppose I should let the Jotuns know as well, Lex thought. It was too bad. He was looking forward to their army's performance the next day. They looked so impressive just standing and posing, he was sure they would have given a phenomenal performance at full force. Back at the makeshift Jotun Empire operations camp, which was nothing more than a room that Anthony had rented, a meeting was taking place between Anthony and the Earthlings. "Listen here, pal," Brandon said, frustration and anger evident in his voice. "We are here offering an alliance, not begging for scraps. We came to you first because of the sincerity that Ragnar showed us. That does not mean you are our only option. We can just as easily go to the beasts from Nibiru. I'm sure they're interested in the prize as well by now." Anthony looked at the five dangerously. His personality was very different from that of Ragnar. Ragnar, despite his brutal and savage nature, was very soft-hearted when it came to humans. He always wanted to nurture them and help them grow. Perhaps this is what happened after thousands of years of fighting a war, liberating humans from the demon's control. Anthony, on the other hand, was ingrained with the arrogance not only of his noble birth but also that of coming from a superior civilization. His usual complicity came from the fact that Ragnar was a man who had proved himself time and time again, and was worthy of commanding him. These plebeians, on the other hand, had not yet earned his respect. It was not that he was against accepting their alliance, but that they were clearly asking for too much. The massive amounts of resources required to raise 3 nascents all the way to the peak of the realm were honestly not so much to Anthony. It was the damned cultivation techniques that the other two requested that were absurd. They had very specific requirements for the cultivation techniques, which were not impossible for the Empire to fulfill. It was the caliber of the techniques that was the problem. This was not mentioning the instructors they requested, as well as the various banks of knowledge of medicine and advanced technology. A few demands were acceptable, but they were asking for too much. "If you find us lacking, then feel free to go and cooperate with those animals. It is of no consequence to me if you wish to put your forces in harm's way. If they really do accept your proposals and decide to cooperate with you, I wish you the best of luck. How the distinct lack of discipline and engineered precision of an experienced army will put your own forces in greater risk is no concern of mine. We would not consider cooperating with someone else if you at least negotiated. You have not changed your initial offer even a single time. You should be grateful," Anthony finally said, no longer having the patience to hide what he was thinking, "that you are even allowed an opportunity to fight alongside a Jotun army. The battle experience your soldiers will gain will be invaluable. It is not something you can gain with working from beasts." Anthony was going to continue his tirade but was interrupted when his personal attendant appeared and mentally passed a message from the innkeeper. The revelation that their number of participants was cut in half disturbed Anthony greatly, but was not enough to demoralize him. Just as the announcements for the details of the game were announced, Ragnar told Anthony to take charge of their deployment and strategy during the games. Ragnar would return to Vegas Minima and begin a planet-wide assault. He needed to be present on the planet to launch their attack as soon as the formation protecting the spawning portal revealed itself. He also needed to make sure the devils didn't do anything desperate, just as they were about to lose the planet. Due to certain precedents, it was unlikely they would forcefully destroy the planet before abandoning it, but they could do a various number of frustrating things. That left Anthony to decide on his own what his objectives were and how he wanted to achieve them. Winning the competition was a greatly attractive opportunity, but much more important than that was ensuring that each of the nodes was destroyed. Even if they had to purposefully give up on winning the prize, their first priority must always be that. After deciding how he wanted to proceed, he turned his attention back to the Earthlings. Truthfully, he still disdained them. Yet his training did not let him ignore any potential useful tool in war. "I will inform you of 2 things, and that will conclude our meeting. What you decide to do after you hear those things is up to you, but I will not waste more time explaining myself. First, the devils will also be participating in the Midnight Games. Their participation has cut down the number of recruits we can send to half. This was something you would learn eventually, so there was no point in hiding this from you. The second thing I want to tell you is that negotiations take place between 2 equals. When one is in a superior position than the other, they do not negotiate, they dictate the terms. Even with our forces cut in half, I personally don't think that you will be our equal. I think that despite our disadvantage, Earth will still perform the weakest out of everyone. But, considering the situation, I will give you an opportunity. I will give you the chance to prove if you are my equal, and deserve to negotiate with us. If, during the first game, Earth is able to accumulate points even remotely close to that of the Jotun Empire, then you can negotiate with me. If not, then you can fall in line and take what you're given, or you can choose to see if the beasts give you a better offer." With his piece said, Anthony invited them to leave. Though not something he enjoyed, Anthony could also play a few mind games. By making their performance the foundation for further cooperation, he would prompt them to do their absolute best. Had they been promised rewards before the battle even began, their soldiers still would have fought, but would have kept more of a survival mentality. Regardless of the outcome, the Earthlings would achieve their goals, so they would do what they could while being safe. But by making the reward based on performance, their soldiers would have to fight with everything and take more risks. Going forward, they would need to continue that level of performance to assure successful cooperation. At that point, whether the Earthlings decided to help the Empire or the beasts, it would not change the fact that they would be fighting their hardest. Anthony was busy with his own schemes while the 5 nascents held another meeting to decide their future line of action. Unfortunately for all of them, Alexander Morrison was going to be the one participating in the games, and he had plans of his own. Chapter 143 Alexander the Arrogant. Helen stood silently in the soft, dim light. For the greater part of an hour, she had not moved an inch. She only watched the teenager as he meditated. Initially, she could barely see anything, but as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she found herself mesmerized by the intense, focused look on Alexander's face. It was not the look of someone searching for peace and meditation, but that of a warrior preparing for combat. Right now, Helen was in Alexander's private security bunker. She had been with him for the past few days, and just a while ago Alexander had asked to take care of a few things. When she returned, she found him like this in the small gym inside the bunker. When she had arrived, he had already been meditating, but she could tell by his heavy breathing and sweat-covered body that he had only recently finished working out. She did not want to disturb him, so she waited. But at some point, when she found herself biting her lower lip, and staring as the sweat rolled down his slightly swollen arms, she realized that she needed to distance herself from the man. Otherwise, despite her decision to look for someone who loved and valued her the way she wanted, she might just spend the rest of her life just like this, standing in the darkness, watching the contours of his face in silence as he strode forward, farther and farther from her reach. While Helen was battling her inner demons and gearing up to make a difficult decision, Alexander was going through an ordeal of his own. He was doing his best to harness the raging energy coursing through his body. It was not as simple as it sounded, not only because he had just recently completed his breakthrough into the Foundation realm in body cultivation as well, thanks to the many zombie cores he used. No, his energy had been raging as if he was just about to fight an entire war on his own. This was because his body was reacting to his will and what he had been planning. But even then, as much as he appreciated and needed the energy, it had to be firmly under his own control. One may wonder, considering Alexander's background, why he was never arrogant towards others. Some may speculate it was a result of proper upbringing, or that his endless training had tempered Alexander's arrogance. But that was far from the truth. Son to excellent parents, grandson to the best of the best, heir to the Morrison family, an only child and trained rigorously not only to surpass his peers but many of his seniors as well, Alexander did not need to act arrogant, it was ingrained into his very bones. But despite all that, he did not behave rudely or with an aura of superiority to those around him. This was because, to Alexander, such petty behavior could not encompass his innate arrogance. Alexander's arrogance could be described and encompassed in only 2 words: absolute control. This was a lesson his grandmother, the person he was closest to in his family, had taught him. His excellence, his superiority, his endless dedication could all only be truly displayed when he was in absolute control. This meant his demeanor, his speech, even his gait were all a certain way because that's how he wanted to display them. Some may think that such rigid control may be unhealthy and may limit his emotional growth, but it was quite the contrary. He did not stop himself from feeling or thinking about certain things, just how he exhibited or reacted to them. For example, if something made him angry, he would not randomly lash out. He would measure the situation and make a decision accordingly. This was a fancy way of saying he did not do things in a reaction to something, but because he chose to. Oftentimes, based on the situation, the result may end up being the same, but it was the mentality that made all the difference. He never did things because he had to, but because he chose to. So then, in a world where he was practically destined to be the best, and his greatest challenges came in the form of pushing himself, Alexander's arrogance remained hidden away from view. Even when Hamad was attempting to assassinate Alexander, he did not behave arrogantly, not because it was not the appropriate reaction, but because he deemed them unworthy of the response. Hamad was not even significant enough of a threat for Alexander to display a behavior letting him know that Alexander thought of the assassin as beneath him. To the young man, he was merely playing a game of chess with predetermined moves, one that would result in his own victory. This was similarly why Russian Princess 77 had been able to elicit such a strong reaction from him. She was a piece in the chess game he never anticipated. She had earned the right of his curiosity, but still not enough for his curiosity to rule him and dictate his actions. But the Midnight Games, they provided him with a stage he never knew he craved. On Earth, the only possible rivals to his family were all actually secretly allies. There was nothing in his life that challenged him from his core. That was not to say that he found everything easy, far from it. Yet, things were only difficult because they were new to him. With the guidance and training of his family, there was nothing he could not overcome. Yet in the Midnight Games, there was a challenge waiting for him that offered no protection. There was no safety net provided by his family, no secret bodyguards, no backup plans. The only thing he could rely on was his own ability. And, as if such a tantalizing new experience was not enough, he was suddenly brought face to face with forces that far outmatched and outclassed anything the Earth had to offer. For the first time in his life, he did not have the advantage simply by existing, and that excited him in a way he had never experienced before. It was exactly for this reason he decided the moment he learned that the Midnight Games would have a combat portion that he would participate no matter what, so long as he was eligible. And, as if guided by the hand of destiny itself, he had just stepped into the realm that allowed him to participate. But, true to his mantra of absolute control, he did not let anyone see his seething excitement. He simply started making plans in the background, unknown even to his own family. This was because of a certain fact even his family forgot. The day he reached the Foundation realm, he no longer needed to listen to anyone, and wielded the full authority of his family. He finally opened his eyes to the image of the teenage girl standing in the distance, looking at him. His sudden gaze made her tremble softly, as if she was unprepared for the power and hunger in his eyes. "Have they sent the location?" he asked with a level voice, standing up. "Yes," she replied in a whisper for some reason. She did not even realize that she was doing so. "Get ready. We'll leave in 10. Helen did not reply and just stood by and watched him leave the room. Alexander took a quick shower and dressed casually in black pants and a white button shirt with blue flower patterns on it in a Hawaiian style. Outside the bunker, it was a bright and sunny day. Putting on a pair of aviators, Alexander got in the driver's seat of a silver convertible Porsche and immediately sped off. Helen was already sitting in the passenger seat, but for some reason would not even look at him. She just watched the beautiful scenery as the duo drove towards their destination. It was her first time in Brazil, so she was just admiring its beauty. That was the excuse she was repeating to herself. It was unfortunate that, because she was turned away the entire time, Alexander did not notice her slightly blushed cheeks and missed out on some beautiful scenery himself. But with the wind blowing in his hair, the vibration of the purring engine felt through the steering wheel, the song, Unstoppable, blasting on the speakers, Alexander was feeling good. In fact, he was feeling very good. So while various forces plotted and planned, not only for the upcoming games for the dominance of each of their respective worlds, he, as a yet unknown player, was simply enjoying himself. Even he did not know that by acting according to own wishes for the first time in his life, he was planting the seeds for a legend that would one day rock the very universe. Softly, without realizing it, he started humming along to the song. He was unstoppable today. Chapter 144. Ready, set, start gambling. Alexander and Helen drove all the way to a private airport, far away from any town or city. It was not the kind of place you could accidentally stumble into. After confirming his identity, the two of them were led to a hangar with a military helicopter. Getting in the pilot's seats, the two of them hurried through the takeoff protocols and left. Alexander was naturally trained to pilot all vehicles so that he could deal with any situation, and Helen, who had been trained to be a wife to a cultivator, excelled in various seemingly random skills. Piloting an aircraft was just one of her many talents. This was exactly why among his close friends group, when he still had one, Alexander would usually trust Helen with a request rather than the others. As much as he tried to hide it, he found it difficult to relate to the usual unengaged and unmotivated rich kids his age. At least Helen always applied herself in whatever she was doing. About an hour after they started flying over land completely untouched by civilization, they suddenly found themselves in a very well-hidden base in a valley. After having his identity confirmed, the two teenagers landed in one of the Morrison family's hidden military bases. While the Morrisons had a minimum military presence on Earth, it wasn't as if they had none. Yet today, the base was a lot busier than usual. Before the Midnight Games began, Alexander had spent some time talking to some of the other guests. He had learned from Chen that Vigus Minima was not the only planet that humans populated within that solar system. Despite that, the other planets were not mentioned by the Innkeeper when he announced the upcoming event. That led Alexander to suspect that only people from the named planets would be able to participate. While he shared his suspicions with his family so that they would make any preparations they needed to, it was only after carefully selecting soldiers for his own small battalion. Technically, organizing a personal battalion for himself would take longer and more careful planning, but this would suffice for his current needs. After careful and deliberate consideration, he selected 1,000 of the best Foundation realm soldiers under his family's command. Originally, he thought that the number was overkill, and that there was no way he would need so many to follow him in the games. As it turned out, the number was still not large enough. But it would have to suffice. Moving any number of troops from one planet to another took time. The only reason he'd even been able to gather 1,000 Foundation experts was because most of them were already on Earth. The ones he had sent from Mars were only the elite few. "How is their battle readiness, Commander?" Alexander asked the man in charge of this base. "They're fully armed, fully prepped and fully briefed. We can have them ready to go in 30 minutes. "Excellent. Do it. I want to be out of here ASAP. The commander nodded and quickly ran off, screaming some commands in the distance. The teenagers simply remained where they were and watched as 1,000 soldiers fell into 100 straight lines in front of them. Alexander naturally did not know all of them, but he had had detailed conversations with all the team captains. They had rehearsed different formations and covered a lot of what to do should communication be disrupted during the games. But, since Alexander had only theoretical knowledge in leading troops and no practical experience, he expected there to be a learning curve, which is why all the captains were also wearing cameras. Alexander would later on review the footage to see how his orders actually reflected on how he could improve. Once he was satisfied, he nodded towards Helen, who opened a bag full of keys. A few hours ago he had her go to the inn and retrieve them. According to the latest update he had received, Earth had not registered any of their participants yet at all. They were involved in whatever they were planning and had not made any actual moves yet. Or, even if they were making moves on Earth, they had not reached the inn yet, which was great for him. Once everyone had the keys, Alexander gave the command and they all simultaneously teleported away with a flash of light. They appeared at the inn in a relatively open area, away from the buildings and the manor. Yet almost instantly, their presence was noticed by the various guests. Their numbers were fewer, and they did not carry the same aura as the Jotun soldiers, but they looked impressive nonetheless. "I'd like to register for the tournament," Alexander said to his personal hologram, the same as every one of his soldiers was doing. "No problem, just give me a moment to start the registration process. We just need to make sure you are eligible to enter the tournament." He could not feel the system scan him, but after just a few moments, he saw a holographic screen appear in his vision. Contestant name, Alexander Morrison. Contestant affiliation, Earth. Contestant ID, E0001. Contestant points, 0. In just a few more minutes, the rest of his troop was registered as well, the last one receiving the ID E1001. The E represented Earth, and the numbers represented the order in which they registered. Once the tournament started, there would, of course, be a rankings board, and with thousands of names it would be difficult to identify which planet each participant belonged to. The ID number would make it easier. "Your registration is complete," the hologram said politely. "Please refrain from returning to your world during the period of the games. If you are not present when a game begins, you will automatically be disqualified." "Sure," Alexander replied casually. The teenager expected that soon he would be summoned by his grandfather and the others, inquiring over his entry and why he didn't at least coordinate with them first. But oddly enough, the summon didn't come. It was ironic then that the highest echelon of Earth remained ignorant of the army that entered under the banner of their planet because they were in a meeting, yet everyone else learned of it. It would be a few hours more before the Earthling realized what had happened and quickly reacted. What their reaction was and how it affected their plans, only time would tell. Lex was too busy to pay attention to what was happening at the inn. As for what Lex was doing, he had returned to Earth and was looking up some information on the latest idea he had. Not that he couldn't figure it out on his own, but he wanted to know how he could benefit the most. As for what he was looking at specifically, why, he was looking up how to set up gambling at the inn. More specifically, he wanted to know how to set up the stakes. There was no way in hell that he would go around setting up stakes that gave twice or thrice the returns for a single bet. He had read enough light novels to know that all it took was some lucky, MC-type character and a very unlikely bet to completely destroy his setup. For a moment, he wondered if he was being corrupted. He himself had never gambled in his life. He hadn't even bought a lottery ticket, but now he was setting up gambling on an interstellar scale. Then he saw a banana store that sold phones for thousands of dollars and then sold the chargers separately. He then realized he was not corrupt. He was simply embracing the human heritage of pursuing profit. When dealing with so many species across the universe, it was important that he remembered his roots. Just like that, the hours flew by and the time came close and closer to the beginning of the games. The inn became unprecedentedly crowded. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers filled the once empty gardens. Anticipating such a situation, Lex had preemptively taken care of things. Sending the soldiers into their separate individual rooms may cause a problem later for their commanders, so he had 3 makeshift bases built representing the 3 worlds. Hundreds of tents filled each of the base, taking care of everything from temporary housing, dining, plumbing to even things like meeting rooms and storage tents. The 3 armies looked vastly different. Even though 2 of the armies consisted of humans, the ones from Earth were wearing a mix of Kevlar and spirit tech, while the ones from the Jotun Empire appeared to be wearing armor that looked like it came out of a Renaissance fair. The beasts, of course, were not wearing any armor, but the fact that many of them were shrunk to the maximum height cap made it evident that once the time came, they would be of a formidable size. It was 3 armies, because as of yet the devils had not brought theirs. But he had no doubts that they would make it in time. Lex almost wanted to take a picture. In fact, once the idea came to him, he could not get it out of his head. Taking out his phone, he took a few snaps of everything secretly. This would be a great story to tell one day. Chapter 145 Lex's Woes. Lex was sitting in his room, casually sipping a cappuccino, observing his inn. Setting up the 3 bases had cost him 30,000 MP, and he deposited another 220,000 MP in setting the stage for the remainder of the games. That 250,000 MP expenditure wiped out most of the accumulation over the past few days, but fortunately, the truth was quite different. This was a direct result of the many soldiers and beasts at the inn. Even though Lex had notified the Jotun leaders that the zombies would likely participate, they did not bother to send back their soldiers. Those 10,000, along with the eventual 10,000 beasts that eventually arrived, made his inn tremendously crowded. Earth had only summoned 5,000 of the Foundation soldiers that would participate in the games, as they absolutely could not afford to bring so many golden core cultivators and have them simply wait. Even though they had their individual bases, they did not stay there all the time. At this point, the inn's lack of growth and size became an issue, as there was no place that remained free of guests. Even the forest surrounding the greenhouse was full of crowds by now. They mistook the formation surrounding the forest for some kind of puzzle or game, keeping in theme with the rest of points of interest at the inn. The sloth and the devils had been unable to reach the middle, fortunately, and Ragnar had not tried, so Lex's farm was safe. The farm, ironically, became Lex's main source of income during this period. His services were not made to handle such a load of guests and were thus always at capacity, and so limited his daily income. But his spirit food, at the cost of 10 MP a meal, could simultaneously feed many. Just counting the soldiers, the 25,000 soldiers and their meals 3 times a day earned him a whopping 750,000 MP. But there were not only these few, as most of the guests who had participated during the first portion of the games also came and went at varying frequencies. He also managed to sell 5 more of his MI suits. This resulted in him making a total of 810,000 MP in the last one day. Naturally, with his spirit food literally being his cash crop, he was especially concerned with not running low on supply. He had stored as much as he could leading up to the event, and using the liger as fertilizer had greatly helped in boosting production, though he had no idea why that would accelerate production speed instead of affecting yield quality. Still, the area of his farm was limited and so could only produce a limited amount at a time. While Lex could do nothing about increasing the size of the farm, at least at the moment, he spent 100,000 MP upgrading the greenhouse to the maximum amount his authority would allow. That upgrade, along with the tremendous aid provided by the sovereign galactic turtle, ensured that he would be able to barely meet the demand. For now. As much as Lex enjoyed the feeling of sitting on a pile of MP, he used another 500,000 MP as the deposit for setting up gambling through the event panel. He would get the deposit back along with whatever profit he made once the event was over, so it was a sacrifice he was willing to make. Lex let out a sigh as he rubbed his head. Managing an event with thousands of people, even with the help of the system, was a great hassle. He had decided, after this event was over, he would take a break and maybe go on a vacation himself. He was constantly on crisis control. As it turned out, while he was enjoying the cultural show, Gerard, under the command of Mary, had been working non-stop. Although there were no upfront fights anymore, there were more than a few minor altercations between humans and beasts. This was mainly a result of beasts still thinking of humans beneath them, and not realizing their actions or words were offensive. More than once, one of the giant beasts had almost stepped on a human, and was only stopped in time by his guards. Another series of incidents that happened with embarrassing frequency was earthling cultivators getting high and not being able to handle it. They were too used to the kind of substances produced on Earth, which barely had any effect on them once they cultivated. Yet many of the guests from Minima Vegas, who were mostly locals of the planet who had been accepted into one of the cities built by the Empire, brought a supply that the Earthlings just could not handle. These did not end up in fights or arguments, but Lex did not like having intoxicated guests lying around. Eventually, he had to make an announcement limiting such substances to their rooms only. There was still another group who were causing Lex problems that left feeling severe, crippling fear because more than once he had reacted similarly to how his parents used to react to him when he was young. This was a group of over 100 students from Troy Academy, the school that Alexander was technically still a student of as well. These students, naturally being connected to the crème de la crème of earthen society, were given the opportunity to come here when enough of their parents visited the inn and discovered how amazing it was, especially for cultivation. The dean of the school, as a man of great influence, happened to be one of the earliest humans to be invited by the 5 families when they were still recruiting people for the cultural show. Once he had seen everything for himself, and was assured by the 5 families that the inn was safe, immediately coordinated with the parents he was able to meet at the inn and organized a field trip. These students were only the first batch to arrive. More would join later. Truth be told, Lex did not mind the kids. In fact, he thought many of them were pretty clever and fun. But when they kept inadvertently leading Gerard into racing with the other chauffeurs, kept trying to climb Little Blue to ride, kept flirting with Velma, and more than once tried to convince the girls to go skinny dip in the tiny lake, as the person responsible for everything Lex had to deal with the situations. He needed to find permanent, non-aggressive solutions, as he could not keep following the kids repeating no. The skinny dipping incident especially nearly gave him a heart attack. They were all underage. Lex did not want to go to moral jail. Rubbing his forehead, Lex cast a look towards the gamer's den. The bright side in all of this was that Z had seemed to find a friend. At least, he thought they were friends. There was a girl with an appearance similar to Z's age sitting with him, watching an anime called Full Wooden Alchemist, both of them struggling to hold back their tears. He wished them both the best. Just as Lex was watching a group of kids who had discovered Icarus wings, just trying to imagine what kind of trouble they were about to cause, something happened to divert his attention. The Devil's Army had finally arrived at the Minima Vegas camp in a predictably sinister fashion. They did not have the discipline of the human armies, nor did they have the naturally aggressive aura of predators that reeked off the beasts. But hundreds of partially rotting corpses astride various sized zombie beasts that were rotting as well made them intimidating in a way that could not be replicated. Just their presence was an assault of nauseating smells. But that was not all. The army of zombies was not being led by a devil, as Lex had expected. Standing at the forefront was a 7 feet tall massive humanoid being covered in an armor that looked more like a collection of scales of various animals than anything forged. Since the requisite to join the games were that they had to be from the planet, Lex assumed that this must be another kind of demon that the devils had assigned on the planet to lead the zombies. He was only partially correct, as while this demon did lead the zombie armies, it was born and raised on Minima Vegas. The devils had merely discovered and used it, not sent it to the planet. Curiosity got the best of Lex and he checked its status. Name, Pramod. Age, 17. Sex, male. Cultivation details, Peak Foundation Realm. Species, Nightmare/Heart Demon. Midnight and Prestige Level, 1. Bloodline, Human. Remarks, do not invite him over for dinner, lest he eat you up. Lex frowned. Pramod's species was clearly indicated as a demon, yet its bloodline was stated as human. Could humans turn into demons? Or was this one of those instances where 2 species procreated and gave birth to a being with a unique bloodline? Chapter 146 Yandra Zombie. The soldiers of the Empire were naturally the first to notice the newly arrived zombie army after Lex. A hush fell upon the entire camp as they angrily eyed the undead horde, wishing that they could attack. As much as the large forces of the universe treated the demons as natural resources to benefit their cultivation, the lower echelons of all civilizations detested them with a burning passion. Many, if not all, of the soldiers present in the camp had suffered the loss of a close friend or relative at the hands of demons. Of course, this also had to do with the fact that, as soldiers, they were more likely to encounter demons than random people. But fortunately, their discipline held, and no one made a move. They had already been informed that there was to be no fighting at the inn. Of course, if the zombies made the first move. But unfortunately, despite their desire to attack, Pramod had a firm hold over them. The demon moved his head, as if looking at the soldiers surrounding him, but there were no eye holes in his scaly armor. Still, after glancing at everyone, he followed his personal hologram as it led him to their part of the camp. Yet even as he led his army away, unbothered by anyone or anything, another army appeared to take its place. These zombies did not appear to be rotting, and some of them could even be said to look somewhat clean. These zombies, all in the Golden Core realm, had various shapes and figures. Though it was still evident that their form used to be basically humanoid, all sorts of extra limbs grew out of them now. Some of them had scales, some of them had wings, some of them had long black nails and hair long enough to be Rapunzel's. Besides looking more disgusting and dangerous, they also looked more intelligent. These zombies stood in a somewhat casual formation and carefully observed their surroundings. They growled at the humans nearby, but despite their instincts, they stopped themselves from attacking without the need for someone to command them. Yet, even though they did not need to be commanded, a leader was still assigned. But unlike Pramod, the leader this time was a zombie. A 4 feet tall, fairly ordinary-looking girl stood at the forefront of the army, focusing intently on a small mirror in her hand. Ignoring the various onlookers, she slowly and carefully applied foundation to her face, ensuring that, despite her undead state, no one would be able to tell. In fact, if it weren't for the ridiculously strong demonic aura she was emitting, many would have actually assumed she was a human. Lex checked her status as well. Name, Harriet Shelby Ruby Selma Jane. Age, 122. Sex, female. Cultivation details, golden core. Species, zombie. Midnight and prestige level, 1. Condition, the patient is suffering from the side effects from a failed artificial animation. The Midnight and currently does not have the means to cure the patient. Remarks, do not let her fragmented mind, undead body, and devious intent fool you. This is a true Yandra in the flesh. Lex was confused by the unusually long list of first names that made up this zombie's name, and the rest of her status did not make much sense to him either. Was she, as a zombie, sick? Did zombies need medical attention? Would he one day have a zombie as a guest, who would then try to use the recovery room? While Lex was pondering, Harriet seemed to finish up her last-minute makeup. She looked at the crowd with a bright smile and then frolicked away. If one did not see the army of zombies following behind her, they really would believe that this was a little girl having fun. By now, the rest of the inn also became aware of the arrival of the zombies. The guests from Earth stood in line at a distance and watched with awe as the hordes disappeared into their own tents. No one had expected such well-behaved zombies, and some of them were even a little disappointed at the anticlimactic arrival. Even Alexander, who was having a serious discussion with his grandfather, was informed of the commotion and came out to observe them. His personal plans did not go over well with the rest of the families, and the fact that he was unwilling to relinquish control of the soldiers following him was a point of contention amongst the humans. Ultimately, they had reached a compromise, but while Alexander was uncaring, the rest of the families were furious at the compromise. Brandon was too supportive of his grandson. The grandfather and grandson duo stood and observed in silence. While Brandon's thoughts were unknown, Alexander's arms slowly started to tremble as he watched the undead army. His eyes wandered over his future enemies, and the more zombies he saw, the tighter his hand clenched into a fist. As it happened, Alexander caught sight of Pramod just as the demon was about to enter its tent. The teenager could not determine the other's cultivation, but his intimidating visage attracted the boy's attention. Pramod, as if sensing a gaze upon himself, stopped and turned directly to Alexander, who stood in the distance. The two stared at each other, as if inspecting prey. Alexander could not stop himself from revealing a smile before his hand suddenly stopped trembling. He turned to leave, suddenly becoming indifferent to whatever was happening. He needed to hone his mood before the games began, his excitement was affecting his control. There were only 2 hours left before the games began and a lot of people could feel the tension in the air. The soldiers did not get nervous, but as the clock came close and closer to the moment of truth, their murderous aura started to leak. Movement across the inn settled down, and slowly everyone returned to their rooms. Even the children from the academy were summoned by their teachers and forced to enter their respective rooms. An artificial silence took hold of the inn. An hour before the event began, the innkeeper appeared at the Colosseum. A display of fireworks over the Colosseum attracted everyone's attention, letting them know it was time for another announcement. The leaders of various factions made their way to their seats and awaited any news their host had to give. As if unaware of the mood that had gripped his guests, the innkeeper let out his usual smile and greeted everyone. Welcome, one and all. The time for the next portion has nearly begun, so I thought I would kick things off and start the party. Lex had been so busy handling the various affairs of the inn that he did not even realize that he was no longer feeling nervous. He was dealing with things as they came and was so preoccupied with making sure everything went smoothly, he appeared before the largest crowd the inn had even held without a second thought. There are just a few things everyone needs to know before we begin. Firstly, as with the previous performances, you will be able to view the games from anywhere in the inn. You can choose to focus on any person or army, and your screens will show them. You can also stay in the Colosseum and watch as it shows the most heated parts of the games. Each game will last 12 hours at most. If the node is not destroyed within that time frame, the game will be considered a loss and no one will receive any points for the destruction of the node, though you'll still be able to receive total points for number of participants survived, and individual points per participant for number of zombies killed. A giant screen appeared above the Innkeeper with a few headings: zombies killed, achievements and total points. But where's the excitement of watching such a game if you don't feel involved? Before the match begins, you can bet on your favorite armies and contenders. Which person will have the highest points? Which planet will take the lead? Who will have the highest kills? Will your favorite contender survive the round? Will the node be destroyed, or will the zombies be able to defend it? Show how much confidence you have in those you support with your bets. The Innkeeper flashed everyone a grin. All bets could only be placed before each game began, and Lex, aware of the deep background of the Jotun Empire and the Devils, had placed an upper cap on each bet. His deposit was only so much, he could not risk it. But that was just a precaution. It was unlikely that anyone would place a single bet with such high stakes. When the game begins, each planet's armies will be teleported to a random place and will begin from there. As for what they can expect once they arrive at their location, well, I can't give everything away now, can I? Unlike previous times where the Innkeeper would disappear after each announcement, he walked off stage and took a seat right in front to watch the games. Even he was feeling excited. Chapter 147. And so it begins. All eyes were on the massive numbers above the Colosseum as they counted down from 15. The guests, the soldiers, the beasts and the various agents, waiting to report back to their planets as soon as the event began, almost felt as if their heartbeats synchronized with the countdown. Loretta and the mysterious devil watched while sipping some green liquid. As casual as their demeanor seemed at first glance, the slightest increase in pressure as she clenched her teeth said otherwise. The sloth that had practically wreaked havoc back on Nibiru looking for eligible beasts, and for the first time made its presence known on the planet, sat extremely comfortably. It had forgotten that it still could not control its strength, and its very sight could destroy mountains back on Nibiru. It would go back and fix things later. Anthony was standing in his room surrounded by various recording and analysis equipment. He planned on recording each game for analysis and review later. Lex was also patiently waiting, though he was no longer sitting alone. A couple of the guests he hadn't had the opportunity to meet before came and introduced themselves. To his left sat Akihiko Tanaka, a Japanese man in his 50s. Oddly, despite his apparent vast influence, he had decided not to cultivate. To his right sat a young man named Remy Laverne. He was an interesting person. He directly came up to Lex and informed him he wanted to use the inn to host a meeting for a secret society and was wondering what kind of benefits Lex could provide, which as could be expected triggered a quest. Lex told him to come and ask him once the midnight games were over. He didn't want to focus on two long quests at the same time. As the seconds passed and the numbers got lower and lower, the anticipation that filled the air was practically palpable. Alexander, adorned in a thin silver armor that only covered his chest, was completely still. His excitement, his anticipation, his anxiety and everything else that he was feeling were buried deep. A mistake he had made when he met Russian Princess 77 was overconfidence, and Alexander never repeated a mistake twice. Even though he was adamant about doing things his own way, he was treating this extremely seriously. So while everyone was looking in the air as the countdown went from 3 to 2 to 1, Alexander only looked forward and tightened his grip on the sword in his right hand and the briefcase in his left hand. The next second a bright light flashed across the inn, momentarily blinding even the strongest cultivator. All the foundation-level armies disappeared. The screens in the air turned on and a wild grassland appeared in view. The plains were vast with nothing but random shrubbery, trees, and tall grass. The devil besides Loretta frowned as he recognized the area, but this was only the beginning. A massive horde consisting of tens of thousands of zombies of all shapes and sizes suddenly appeared right in the center. About 5 miles away from the zombies in 3 different directions, 3 different armies appeared. The beasts and earthlings still had a moment to adjust, but for the soldiers of the Empire, the battle began immediately. Right as the event was about to begin, Ragnar had the entire planet under supervision, not only by the several Juggernaut-class vessels that surrounded it, but with his own spiritual sense as well. He even had special spatial fluctuation detection devices installed planet-wide so that he would know immediately when the various armies arrived on the planet. But things did not play out according to the simplest and easiest prediction of teleporting the 3 armies onto the planet, which in a way is exactly what Ragnar expected. The spatial fluctuation devices started beeping, but before anyone had any time to investigate their results, Ragnar physically felt a change in the fabric of space around the planet. He opened scans of the planet from the Juggernaut's view and 10 opaque domes became visible on various parts of the planet. He located the closest one and immediately dashed towards it to investigate. Completely ignoring the hordes of zombies that surrounded the dome, Ragnar approached it and tested it out using a device because he was doubtful of his suspicions. But the result corroborated what he thought. The area within the dome had somehow been transformed into a pocket realm, without actually cutting off the space from the planet itself. How this was possible, Ragnar did not know, nor could he understand. What he was able to determine, though, was that, because the space was not cut off, the pocket dimension shared the same atmosphere and ecosystem as the planet instead of developing one itself. This also allowed the nodes to continue to function, as if they had been teleported away or moved into a pocket dimension cut off from the formation they were supposed to be running. The formation would fail. But that was not all. All zombies above the golden core realm within the dome were being ejected outside. He suspected that likewise, all zombies above the Foundation realm were being ejected from whichever dome was hosting the current game. Just as he was about to return, he noticed a particularly strong demon ejected from the dome. A demon of this level was not supposed to be on this planet. Clearly it had been hiding near the node, protecting it, but how could it escape the sight of the Innkeeper? Ragnar was now thoroughly convinced that the Innkeeper was many levels above himself. The general and the demon exchanged looks, but did not engage. Ragnar was still the stronger one, but a fight of their level would activate the formation surrounding this planet. He had no choice but to let the demon leave. Ragnar returned to his command room and gave the order for an all-out attack. While the games handled the destruction of the nodes, he would handle the rest of the planet. The moment the game began, various beasts and humans disappeared from the inn. One particular beast reappeared in a jungle, face to face with a massive snake. "The games have begun," the beast said, "and the sloth is preoccupied. It will not return to Nibiru for at least 12 hours while the games take place. I did not spot Ijishima in the Colosseum, but it is likely in its room. Considering a lack of response from Red Nation, I think it's still unaware of the situation. It likely won't return before the games end." "You've done well," the snake replied, its voice much happier than its expression portrayed. "Pass down my orders, begin a full assault. We must take all of its territory before it returns. I'll have a nice surprise waiting for it when it comes back home." "Yes sir," the beast replied, and immediately left. On Earth, a virtual meeting was once again taking place in the bunker under the Sahara. But no one was speaking, they were all waiting silently. Eventually, a person appeared in the room as if teleporting from somewhere. "The games have begun, they will be occupied. But they'll likely return the moment they get news that something is happening. Are you sure you want to do this? Why not wait till the Golden Core soldiers are committed instead of the Foundation ones?" "Cowardice will not ignite the flames of revolution," said a feminine voice. "We were preparing to take on their full strength anyway. The disappearance of a few thousand Foundation realm experts is already a great boon. Not to mention, the longer we wait, the longer there is a chance for a mistake. Since the preparations have been made, we will begin now. Pass down the orders. Everyone get into your marked positions and prepare the weapons. In 2 hours exactly, we'll strike all targets at the same time. Even if the family heads return, the moment we start, it'll be too late for them to do anything." Without replying, the various holograms started disappearing. In 2 hours, the destiny of Earth would change. On the battlefield, Alexander quickly scanned the terrain for potential threats the moment he appeared. Seeing no immediate danger, he sent out a few scouts before kneeling to start the device that looked like a briefcase in his left hand. It took him a few minutes, which was enough time for his soldiers to secure the surrounding area. Fortunately, there were no enemies nearby, so they would be uninterrupted in the short term. The rest of the human army separated from them, clearly acting under a different commander. Alexander did not mind. When the device was ready, he took a few steps back and watched as a dozen mini-satellites were launched into the air. When they reached high enough and their rocket trails ended, the satellites activated their cloaking mechanism, hiding them from plain sight. They could still be detected using spiritual sense. They weren't completely covert, but this was good enough. In only a few minutes, Alexander obtained a live projection of the entire terrain. Identifying the location where the Empire soldiers were clashing with the zombies that arrived with them, Alexander passed out orders and began moving. Even if he wanted to test himself, he would do it in the smartest and most efficient way. Chapter 148 Cara de Achborn. The sound of screaming, fighting, explosions and the clashing of metal resounded as Crawford, 41, directed his troops. The moment they were teleported, exactly 100 zombies adorning their zombified beasts each assaulted them. Their suicide attack was vicious and extremely lethal. These zombies had some kind of ability that affected a large area which directly immobilized the side of the Jotun forces facing them. Acidic mucus rained down upon them while sharp bone splinters crashed against their defenses, threatening to split them apart. The ground was split asunder as bloody tentacles erupted from beneath, trying to cut through anything in its path. The roars of over 100 angry zombie beasts thundered across the army, threatening to tear their eardrums. With claws sharp enough to tear through metal, they slashed at the defending soldiers. It was as if Armageddon was raining down upon the humans. An overwhelming evil was crashing against a small army, one that had gripped the entire universe with fear and hate. Yet even as fire and fury rained upon the humans, like a scene depicting the end times in many religions, the humans stood firm. Against steel and bone, against bloody maws and spiked claws, against the full strength of the Suicide Squad, not a single soldier fell. Shoulder to shoulder, the front line dug in and stood their ground, protecting their brothers and sisters behind them. Death could not scare them and a maelstrom of attacks could not make them stumble. Wielding shields that grew into massive, 8 feet tall and 3 feet wide versions of themselves, these soldiers were the pride of an empire. Known only as the Bulwark Team, they were the dedicated protectors of each Jotun army. Finally, the zombies reached the soldiers and crashed against the makeshift wall of shields. The beasts rammed their bodies as the zombies used their unusual limbs and claws to cut through the barricade. The very ground shook from the force of the collision, and even the viewers back at the inn trembled unconsciously as they saw the sight, but true to their prestige, the Bulwark Team's defense remained unpenetrated. From the time the game had started, not even a minute had passed. Yet the moment the zombies crashed against the shields, their momentum was interrupted. This was the opportunity that the Jotun soldiers had been waiting for. Squads 3 and 5, circle around and attack from behind. Bulwark Team, hold them down. Crawford, 41 commanded. In a calm yet quick way, the soldiers started moving, acting according to their orders. The purpose of the Suicide Squad of zombies was to hold the soldiers in place as the rest of the zombies retreated to meet with their main force. Tier 3 zombies, equivalent to Foundation cultivators, started to attain intelligence, but it was still in a very primitive form. They could understand their instinctual desires to feed, and to a degree plan how to get what they wanted, but the concept of teamwork or long-term planning escaped them. The Jotun forces did not know how big the main force of zombies would be, but under the command of a proper leader such as Pramod, their lethality would increase exponentially. Pramod wanted to get to the main force while maintaining his initial number of zombies, while the Jotun soldiers wanted to stop him, no matter what. While the soldiers fought, Pramod and his mounted units had already gained a huge lead. Soon, a chase would begin that would determine how the rest of the games went. As strong as the army was, dealing with suicidal enemies was not easy. It took an entire 30 minutes before the zombies were dealt with no Jotun casualties or injuries, of course. Once the suicide zombies had been eliminated, Crawford, 41 checked on his soldiers as well as the fallen corpses. After running a quick scan, they realized that these zombies had been poisoned with a deadly, fast-acting virus. Had even a single soldier been injured, within minutes he would have died, and then subsequently turned into a zombie. It was unknown if only the 2,500 zombies were poisoned, or if all of them were. Depending on the answer, this could be even more dangerous. Furthermore, none of the zombies dropped cores. This was because the devils had attached a collection formation to each node to automatically collect all zombie cores within a certain area. Since they knew a battle was upcoming, there was no reason to leave such a boon to their enemies. According to preliminary scans, the chances of this battlefield being Sector 776 are incredibly high, a technician informed Crawford, 41. As we move, I'll continue to scan the terrain, which should confirm our location. Once the location has been determined, we can cross-match our location with a scan of the planet to get a detailed map of the area. Good. Once the location has been determined, forward the map to me. Everyone, assume pursuit formation and immediately begin chasing after Target 1, but keep an eye out for ambushes. They will not let us catch up easily, but we cannot let them meet up with their main force. Needing no further instructions, the soldiers reorganized themselves to facilitate a chase and immediately began. As expected, Pramod had left behind various traps and ambushes to slow them down. The good news was the Jotun soldiers suffered no casualties. The bad news was that Pramod and his army, atop their mounts, were gaining the lead. While Crawford, 41 and his soldiers gave chase, and Alexander and his soldiers made a beeline to cut Pramod off, the rest of the human soldiers had set up a temporary camp and started scouting the area using drones. Their first objective was locating the enemies and understanding the terrain before making a plan of action. It was not as simple as simply fighting the zombies, as the Innkeeper had said unexpected things may happen during the games. Since their objective was to get as many points as possible to prove their worth, they had to act accordingly. Unlike the humans, who all moved with clear purpose, the beasts divided themselves into 3 different groups, each with their own plans. The largest group was formed of wolves who were originally from Bloodfang's territory. They wasted no time whatsoever and ran off on their own. They were searching for their prey, and would decide what to do once they found them. The second largest group was one made of elephants. The elephants all boasted a natural advantage in brute strength and defense. They had been forced by the sloth to participate, and behaved begrudgingly. They knew that if they did nothing, there would be hell to pay once the game was over, yet at the same time, they did not want to be too proactive. The sloth might have been a little more lenient had any of the elephants inherited the fiery mammoth bloodline, but none of them had. It was not so far as to say that the elephants were disposable, but forcing them to participate in the games, at least, would not get the sloth in trouble. The third and smallest group was a random collection of strong beasts. Some of them came willingly for the promised rewards by their territory leaders, some of them had been threatened, all of them were uninformed about what they should be doing. Reaching an unspoken consensus, they decided to simply follow the elephants from a distance. Only 30 minutes had passed and another 11.5 hours remained, yet even while most were still planning their moves, the crowd at the inn was going wild. Everyone was expecting a clash right at the start due to the presence of the zombies, but the ferocity of the fight had taken them by surprise. The humans hooted and chanted for the valiant soldiers, and the 5 nascents looked on with the utmost seriousness at the soldiers that surpassed anything they could have imagined. Not a single soldier had died so far, despite the onslaught. It let them know firmly what their place in the universe was. Lex was especially amazed, this being the first time he'd properly seen cultivators fight. It was a shame that he had to maintain his distant image as the innkeeper, otherwise he would be chanting with the crowds as well. Even he did not know what surprises were in store for the participants, so he, too, was watching on in suspense. Besides the various screens showing what was happening to the participants, another screen depicting the points received a lot of attention. The Jotun Empire had 200 points for killing 100 zombies and 100 of their mounts, but the distribution for the individuals was what attracted the most attention. While most of the names on the list so far had 1 or 2 kills to their name, a single name stood out, Kara Deathsworn, v 2001. Kara Deathsworn was her name and v 2001 was her registration number. The V let people know that she was from Vegas Minima. The reason why her name attracted so much attention was because of the number of points she had accumulated, 29. While each of the soldiers had 1 or 2 kills, she had 29. A lot of the guests found themselves turning their screens to her and watching replays of her fight. Maybe a lot of them were expecting to see some beautiful warrior, cutting through the zombies like a valiant hero. Unfortunately, they could not see her face under her helmet, and armor was not designed with visual appeal as a priority, so it did not look too flattering. What they were able to catch was a moment when her armor was damaged around her arm. Before the armor stretched itself to cover the damaged area, the guests were able to catch a glimpse of rock-hard, extremely lean muscles. It woke many of the viewers up to the truth that Deathsworn was not a fairy warrior out of an anime. She was a soldier, and she was built like a killer. For some reason, that only increased her number of fans. Chapter 149 Pride of the Weeb Community. A few minutes into the chase, the crowd started diverting their attention to the other participants. At first, it seemed that the others were just doing their own form of recon, until someone noticed that Alexander and his army were moving too quickly in a straight line for it to be reconnaissance. Unlike the actual participants, the guests had access to a map which showed the location for each of the participants. When someone finally realized that Alexander was moving directly to intercept Pramod, excitement filled them and they spread the word. Alexander was coming from Pramod's left, and based on the distance would intercept them only 1.5 miles away from the main zombie horde. The fact that the previously mentioned horde was also slowly moving outwards made the point where the two would clash uncomfortably close, but only for the participants. For the guests, the possibility of a larger clash only made it more thrilling. One would think that Alexander's family would be worried for him at this point, as the other Nascents slightly were, though their reasons were different. No, the Morrisons could be seen sitting together, casually chatting amongst themselves. Brandon would sometimes whisper something in his wife's ear that would make her chuckle, while Ragnar and Hilary, Alexander's mother, seemed to be discussing the details of the other armies. A few moments of peace filled the time, but instead of boring the guests, it only served to build the anticipation. Alexander's clash would be extremely dangerous, especially considering that he was outnumbered almost 2-1. He was aware of this fact, as his satellites gave him the most detailed information amongst the participants. He knew he only needed to hold them long enough for the Jotun soldiers to catch up. He was not doing this because of some agreement with the Empire, or because his family told him. This was simply the best course of action for him. Numerically, this was the smallest target and also one with the greatest return in terms of weakening his enemy. The wait was not long, in only a few minutes, the two armies came within sight of one another. If he did not move into position to block them, Alexander would have employed a long-range attack, but that would only slow down their speed. So at this moment, he urged his troops to move even faster while the enemy had not noticed them. This was a drawback of having zombies as subordinates. They could not warn Pramod of the approaching army, even if they spotted it due to their lacking intelligence. But they were fighting in a plain, the view was largely uninterrupted. Pramod finally noticed the army when they were almost directly in their path, and without hesitation, passed out a command. The army of zombies split in two, one continuing to move in a straight line and another turning right and moving that way. Alexander had no way of knowing which of the groups Pramod was in, as his satellite was not capable of providing such detailed information, not that he could have done much even if he knew. In a few moments, Alexander got into position to block the incoming horde. Lay down suppressive fire. Alexander commanded into a mic, prompting a barrage of artillery fire. But even as bullets tore through the air, they were unable to deter the oncoming horde. The zombies launched their own counterattack as they neared, ready to directly tear into Alexander's army. Yet the spirit tech used by the Morrison family, while unable to match the quality of the Empire, was extremely imaginative. Some of the soldiers were wearing an unusual backpack out of which hundreds of mini-drones kept flying out. Flying in front of Alexander, they seemed to form some kind of formation. They remained unreactive as friendly fire passed them by, but whenever an enemy attack neared, an electric field was formed between the drones that zapped the attack. Unfortunately, while the field served to destroy some of the attacks, some of them were only weakened. As the soldiers suffered the attacks, the stark difference between their armor and gear compared to the Jotuns once again became evident. Although there were no casualties so far, many soldiers were already injured in the first volley. But since the two forces were different in many ways, there was no need for them to use the same tactics. Alexander was not planning on taking on a direct collision of a charging force. He was planning on tearing them apart. Penetration Tactic 1, Alexander calmly commanded, as if he was not under attack. Behind him, his 6 blades became airborne. The defining difference in combat between Foundation realm cultivators and those below that realm were the spiritual techniques that one could use. They became more versatile, and a wider array of options were available to you. While most techniques served a single purpose and were driven by the energy a single person could provide, such techniques were less common in war. 100 of the soldiers behind Alexander wielded unusually heavy weapons that had the shape of a rocket launcher. The fact that, despite their cultivation, the soldiers were struggling to hold it demonstrated their weight. But while there were only 100 soldiers with such weapons, a thin blue line was formed in the air, connecting the weapons to the rest of the surrounding soldiers. They were all using an energy build-up technique. Such a spiritual technique was usually the build-up for a larger attack, but this took things one step further. In the presence of another person using the same technique, a blue line made of spiritual energy connected them, multiplying the speed at which they gathered energy. In the presence of 1,000 people using the same technique, a web was formed and the energy buildup was so quick and massive it threatened to blow up the very people using the technique. Then, via the blue lines, the energy was transferred to the weapons, which had already been aimed. It barely took a few seconds for all of this to happen, and just as the zombie horde was about to crash into the soldiers, the weapons fired. 100 blue balls of flames launched with the ferocity of a bolt of lightning and roared like a continuous clap of thunder. Completely eviscerating the zombies in their path, the blue flames traveled 50 feet before destabilizing and exploding. The force of the attack launched the zombies in the air, the heat of the flames burning those in its path to a crisp, the shockwave of the attack causing them to fall over. Yet this was not meant to be Alexander's main attack. This only broke the momentum of the charging army. Sword in hand, blade hovering behind his back, Alexander was the first to charge into the zombie horde, followed closely by his soldiers. Originally, Alexander would have liked a long-range battle where he could use his spirit tech to destroy the zombies before they even got close. But since they were already too close to the horde by the time they blocked their path, he would not shy from doing things up close and personal. Considering his recent entry into the Foundation realm, Alexander should have been at a disadvantage. But someone forgot to tell that to his blades that were ripping through enemies like paper. He could not act with the flexibility and precision he liked, and so often only cut off limbs instead of beheading zombies, allowing them to survive. But his soldiers would take care of the weakened zombies, he only needed to guide them and lead them on the path to victory. His blades carried a red hue, a visual effect of the spiritual technique he was using, unending solder. Its effect was simple yet powerful, it gave his blades a massive increase in cutting power. A zombie that had somehow turned invisible suddenly latched itself onto Alexander with octopus-like tentacles and bit at his throat. Yet before the zombie could succeed, a blast of spiritual energy emerged from Alexander's body and ripped the tentacles away and threw the zombie far away. This was the effect of a defensive body technique Marlowe had gifted him when he entered the Foundation realm, magnetic pulse. Unfortunately, Alexander's grandfather got his hands on the technique and changed it just a bit before Alexander learned it. As a result, Alexander's hair was not standing up straight as his body was surrounded by a visible, golden aura, looking very much like a certain anime character. The 100 students from Troy Academy who were watching their senior fight were losing their minds as they screamed and shouted. This was the pride of their academy. This was the pride of Earth. And this was the pride of the weeb community. Alexander himself did not notice his peculiarity and continued to ruthlessly cut down his enemies, which only kindled the passion in his fans' hearts. Even some of the Jotun soldiers who were watching the fight were attracted to the literal golden child of Earth. Chapitre 150 Antony Surprise. The crowd was heated up. The hooting and the chanting were the least of it. Whether it was the demons, the earthlings of the Empire, they were all analyzing each and every moment, recording all the data they could for their own reasons. Earth's technology was subpar, as expected, but their application of it was interesting. The most interesting, though, was the way the soldiers fought. Charging behind Alexander, they cut through the zombie ranks like grass. Once surrounded, they broke off into pairs, each wielding a sword and a shield. Each pair attacked and defended when needed, making up for their partner's weaknesses. It went beyond simple partnership, that was not something unseen in the universe. The pairs used spiritual techniques one at a time, alternating between them, but it was almost as if each technique strengthened the subsequent one. It was as if the new technique was feeding off the remaining spiritual residue of the previous one, somehow increasing its own strength. But the accumulation had a flexibility to it that seemed almost impossible. The duo did not need to attack consecutively to gather energy, even if they used a defensive technique, it fit perfectly into the cycle of gathering momentum. It almost seemed as if the soldiers had an entire repertoire of techniques that fed off each other. Finally, when the accumulated strength reached the limit of what the soldiers could maintain, they slashed their swords in the air together, releasing a blade of spiritual energy that traveled through the zombie horde, cutting them in half. As if that wasn't impressive enough already, the spiritual blades somehow didn't injure the other earthlings at all. At this point, even Anthony admitted that he had severely underestimated these specific humans. Their technology was backwards and so was their cultivation. Many of them were getting injured as they fought, a much shakier performance than the soldiers of the Empire. Instead of fighting like one large, cohesive army, they were fighting in smaller, weaker units. Yet, despite all that, they were killing the zombies faster than the Empire had. They employed a way of fighting Anthony had never seen before. Recording them as they fought, Anthony was sure that when the experts of the Empire saw this footage, they'd be able to identify the underlying logic and create even better techniques. For now though, Earth had the lead in this new way of fighting. While the soldiers fought in pairs, the Golden Boy of Earth, a title that he had officially earned now, Alexander fought on his own. Two of his blades were spinning like the blades of a blender at imperceptible speeds, mincing any zombies that tried to attack him from the back. The other 4 blades attacked the zombies at his sides, as if they had eyes of their own. In front of him, Alexander used his own sword to cut a path, though occasionally he would be overcome by barbaric tendencies and smash the zombies in his path with his free hand. To the viewers, it seemed like an unending symphony. To them, he was dancing flawlessly, finding the perfect way to move in a situation where the slightest mistake would cost him his life. It was the epitome of elegance. To Alexander, it was chaos. It was heat. It was loud. And it was bloody. This was not the first time he had led soldiers on a mission, but it was the first time he was in a war. His mind was working in overdrive, not only to anticipate how the zombies would attack him and what he needed to do to retaliate, but also keeping track of his soldiers. He needed to give orders if their performance deviated, or if they were doing better or worse than expected. Yet, after a certain point, he could no longer keep track of the soldiers. As much as he didn't want to, he ended up making the decision that the best thing he could do in this situation was kill as many zombies as possible instead of keeping track of the army. So, he went from doing his best to going beyond his limits. He was already using spiritual and body techniques at the same time, a feat that marked him on a level beyond genius. Now it was time to do even more. His speed and strength suddenly increased, and the golden aura around him intensified. He went from reacting to the zombies' attacks to cutting them down before they could even make a move. With his blades in the air and his sword in his hand, Alexander attacked in each direction, becoming a cyclone of death and devastation. 5 minutes into the battle, the chasing soldiers finally caught up. As surprised as he was to see the situation, Crawford, 41, did not waste any time in giving his orders. Like a charging cavalry, the soldiers crashed into the zombies that had their backs turned. Over 100 zombies died immediately, and the remaining ones were only just beginning to realize that they were being attacked on both sides. Alexander immediately felt the change, and dove even deeper into the horde, moving away from the relative safety of his soldiers. His efficiency increased, and now that he no longer felt overwhelmed, Alexander finally began to feel exhilaration. This is what he was searching for, to prove himself through fire and steel and war. Amongst the bloody and ugly horde, Alexander suddenly caught sight of a single soldier in a familiar armor. It was the armor of the Jotun Empire. Quickly, he realized that the Empire had joined and passed new orders into his mic. Retreat and initiate teardown tactic 2. With reinforcements grabbing the zombies' attention, he could take more effective and less dangerous methods of attack. The battle was evolving quickly, and before even realizing it, Alexander found himself fighting closely with that soldier. It was then that he realized, despite not having as many weapons as him, this soldier's killing efficiency was close to his. As the soldier's two-handed sword cleaved down to split a zombie in half, one of Alexander's blades collided with it just a little, causing the blade to deviate. Instead of slicing the zombie in half, it only cut off the zombie's various tentacles, giving Alexander's blade just enough time to cut its head off. The soldier looked at Alexander for a split second with a frown under her helmet, but didn't waste any time on him. She continued her attack, but quickly noticed that every time she was about to go for a kill, one of the flying blades just happened to deviate her sword just a bit. "What the hell are you doing?" she finally roared at the teenager, unable to keep her anger suppressed. "Winning," was his one-word reply. He did not slow down his assault, nor did he turn to look at her. In fact, his killing prowess increased. Kara ground her teeth as she stared at him like she wanted to slice him in half. She finally understood what was happening. He was preventing her from getting kills and stealing her points. Truth be told, she did not care for the points at all. But the more Alexander stopped her from getting them, the more she wanted them. Tightening her grip on her sword, the lone soldier went on an absolute rampage. At this point, it seemed more like a competition between the two than an actual battle. But the competition ended quickly. With the zombies diverting their attention to the new soldiers, the Morrison troops were able to retreat and got enough time to assemble and ready one of the heavy weapons they had brought. "Teardown tactic 2 ready," Alexander heard a voice say in his ear. "Take cover," was all Alexander said to the soldier, before leaping into the air to escape. Caught unprepared by the sudden action, Kara did not know whether to listen to the golden bastard's instructions. That's when she heard the roaring, and leaped for cover. Back at the inn, all the guests were once again filled with excitement as they saw all the Morrison troops once again connected to one another with blue spirit lines. But this time, instead of feeding the energy to 100 soldiers, it was fed to just one. The soldier, whose legs were bolted to the ground using tethers and plates dug into the dirt, pulled the trigger. As the barrels started spinning, it seemed for a moment like any other ordinary gun. That illusion was quickly dispersed the moment it started firing. Red spirit bullets started shooting out of the gun so fast, instead of a stream of bullets it seemed like the soldier was shooting a laser. At a speed of a little over 150 bullets a second, this gun, at the cost of a massive amount of spirit energy, completely eviscerated everything in its path. The soldier was able to fire for almost 2 minutes before the strain of so much spirit energy coursing through his body made him collapse, but that was enough. Only a few zombies were left anyway. Some of the soldiers that followed Alexander had died, many of them were injured, and almost all of them were exhausted. Compared to the near-peak state of the Jotun forces, their performance seemed pathetic. But that was only if you could not see the points board hanging in the air in the Colosseum, which showed just how many zombies the army had killed in a little under 20 minutes. Chapter 151 Developments. Alexander and his troops regrouped while the Jotuns finished the zombies off. Other than Alexander, who was simply tired, all his troops looked beaten and battered. This was not to say that they were weak or inexperienced. Their equipment just didn't match up to the standard of the Jotuns, and their techniques, while ingenious, did not have the same spirit energy efficiency. But despite all that, Alexander was quite satisfied. This had been a quick skirmish after a long chase, which gave them little to no time to prepare. When they attacked the main zombie horde, they would have better preparations. The only regret that Alexander had, other than his few dead soldiers, was that they were not able to attack Pramod. He clearly had escaped with the other group of zombies. By now, he had already joined the main horde. Once the last of the zombies were finally killed, Alexander ordered his soldiers to retrieve the bodies for their soldiers. They needed to understand how they died, in case it was something preventable. In the meantime, Alexander walked towards Crawford, 41. Over the past day, everyone had already gained some idea of who the commanders of each army was, which is why Alexander knew exactly who he needed to talk with. On the other side, Crawford, 41 looked at Alexander with a mix of amusement and respect. Though there were areas in which they were lacking, this was probably one of the best performances he had seen from someone belonging to a sky-level civilization, a civilization unable to leave their star system. Not to mention, their killing efficiency was very high and their losses, considering their limited resources, were very few. That was where his respect came from. His amusement originated when he heard a report saying that Alexander actually tried to compete with Kara. Alexander could not be blamed for not knowing about the Deathsworn family, he did not have the relevant exposure. Still, considering the crazy and suicidal antics of the Deathsworn, it was rare to see someone even be in a situation dangerous enough to compete with them, let alone have the frame of mind necessary to compete rather than survive. Crawford, Alexander acknowledged the young man, approaching him. They were actually similar in age, with Crawford, 41, being in his late 20s. One would think that with the background of the universe, cultivators would have already surpassed the Foundation realm by their late 20s, but that was not so. Unlike on Earth, where it was an amazing feat for Alexander to break into Foundation in 2 years, it was not considered impossible for the rest of the universe. They just simply didn't, despite being able to, because there was no real advantage to rushing their cultivation. It was a difference in perspective brought about by a difference in environment. If you're going to shorten my name, I prefer you call me 41, the man replied. Did you encounter the armored demon? I tried to intercept him, but they broke off. He's met up with the main horde by now. Crawford, 41, frowned. They had already failed one objective, which was not a good start. Then he looked towards the teenager. His previous golden aura had disappeared, and he could see a bit of fatigue in his eyes. They were technically competitors for the prize, but the main objective was still to destroy the nodes, and this teenager had already proved useful. With all of that in mind, Crawford, 41, said, "You should check up on your soldiers. These zombies have all been laced with a special poison that makes even the slightest of scratches lethal." Alexander grimaced and immediately passed on the news. All his soldiers who had been wounded were mostly suffering from blunt force trauma. The ones who had suffered scratches or bite were the ones that were dead. He would have to change some of his plans, but that was for later. Currently, he came to Crawford, 41, for only one reason. I don't know if you know this already or not, but the main zombie horde is massive. We are gravely outnumbered. I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but they range anywhere from 30 to 40,000 zombies. This is not a fight we can engage in alone, especially now that there is a demon capable of planning in charge of them. Crawford, 41, was not aware of this, but he only slightly frowned before his expression returned to normal. This is crucial information. We need to communicate with the other humans and beasts and plan an attack, but we can't waste too much time either. I have the means to communicate with the other Earthlings, Alexander said. We just need to contact the beasts and hope they listen. The two immediately started planning. Even though they were competitors, without each other's help, neither of them would succeed. Like this, another hour passed by before they were ready to lay siege to the main force. Alexander's army used this time to rest and recover their spent spirit energy. All was progressing smoothly, or smooth enough. But as the 2-hour mark approached and all the armies readied positioned themselves for the attack, something similar was happening on Earth. Zeus Leventus, a descendant of the Leventus family from New Las Vegas on the moon, stood nervously in the space carrier. Hovering silently over a mining facility on the dark side of the moon, the space carrier was one of many, each holding dozens of soldiers. The greatest irony of it all was that this particular mission was being overseen by one of Zeus' great uncles. They were attacking this facility not for the benefits it would provide, but to arrest control from the forces that occupied it. This was a strategic resource, the absence of which would cripple the economy on the moon. Zeus was woken from his daydreaming when the speakers released a very determined voice saying, "All forces, attack." As if a switch had been flipped, the night went from calm and peaceful to immediately being extremely chaotic. All the carriers opened fired, not only penetrating the oxygen dome formations surrounding the facility, but the various outposts as well. The doors opened, and the soldiers jumped out, a jetpack accelerating their descent that was slowed by the weak gravity. The craziest thing was that despite all the chaos, it was eerily silent due to the lack of atmosphere. Except for the tremors that could be felt on the surface of the moon and the occasional flashing light of a grenade, there was no evidence of the chaos taking place. Zeus also jumped and followed his team as they descended. He needed to get to a computer still connected to the interplanetary network as soon as possible. Deep inside his heart, he already knew that the network was likely already shut down by whoever orchestrated this attack, but still, he hoped. He needed to communicate with Alexander. That was the only way either of them would have any hope of surviving. Little did he know, Alexander was nowhere near Earth to begin with. On Earth itself, the situation was both extremely chaotic and extremely peaceful. Various soldiers positioned in strategic locations began an attack at the same exact time worldwide. For some unusual reason, there was little to no resistance to the attacks. Dams, solar power fields, nuclear reactors and basically any kind of power supply stations worldwide were taken over and shut down. Government buildings were invaded with an efficiency that should have been impossible. The few islands of resistance that could be found worldwide were mostly independent groups, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Quickly, though, they too surrendered. Most, if not all, nuclear weapons facilities were overrun. All nuclear submarines lost contact with the surface. Before any of the soldiers left behind by the 5 family heads could use their keys and report the situation, they were killed. The precision with which each person loyal to the family heads, in possession of a golden key, was killed, spoke volumes. In London, in a quaint little house, there was a young girl playing games on her phone when suddenly she disconnected from the internet. She groaned and got up to reset her internet router, but suddenly her house lost power. Confused by the sudden development, the girl's mind had only just begun to think of possible reasons for why this could be happening, such as a broken wire to the main transformer or something, when one of her elder sisters barged into her room. "Something is happening. I was on a call when I heard gunshots on the other side, and the phone disconnected. Then the electricity went out. We need to contact Mom and Dad," the younger girl was only beginning to say, when her second and oldest sister walked into the room. "No, in case of an unexpected development, we need to establish communication with the relay station and ask for instructions." Her voice was cold and commanding, just like her eyes. "Belle, what about Big Brother?" the young girl reluctantly asked, slightly afraid of the answer. "According to our surveillance, Lex's location is unknown. He is most likely safe," Belle frowned slightly. "He is most likely safe, but I'll request the relay station to send down some security. Dad won't like the interference, but if the situation is dangerous enough, he'll allow it." "What about us?" the middle sister, Liz, asked. "What about us?" Belle replied blandly. "First of all, we don't even know if something serious is even happening in the first place. And even if something serious is happening, these bodies are just spirit clones. Even if they die, nothing will happen to us. Not to mention, their purpose has already been fulfilled. We only need to contact the relay station and act according to their orders." Just as the younger girls were hoping everything was all right, the sudden sound of gunfire woke them to the truth. Then someone kicked down their house door and soldiers started pouring in. Chapter 152 The Pride of Uncle Sam. It seemed that all of a sudden, Earth was in chaos. In the most well-executed and efficient manner in the history of the planet, regimes fell and new rulers took their place. One would think that the ICPAs would resist the change, but ironically, it was the ICPAs that led most of the rebelling armies. With an in-depth understanding of the regions they policed, they knew exactly what to do to seize actual control rather than simply protect them. At the rate that things were progressing, even though all the family head spies were killed, it would only be a matter of time till someone else with a golden key escaped to the inn. Yet that was a matter for the future. Right now, all eyes were on the massive screen as the first joint assault on the zombie horde was about to begin. Earth was in the lead with the highest number of points, and as for the person with the most kills, it was neither Alexander nor Kara Deathsworn. It was the soldier wielding the Gatling gun, NPC-1. But no one focused on him, or why he had such an unusual name. Their focus was on the fact that Kara had a total of 51 kills now, while Alexander had 53. Alexander had quickly taken the lead from her, and by denying her kills kept her total behind his. The audience had inadvertently dubbed the two rivals and could not wait to see how things continued. The assault was not as coordinated as Crawford, 41 would have liked, but the fact that everyone agreed to attack at the same time was already good enough for him. A total of 12,500 going up against anywhere between 30 to 40,000, not to mention less than 10 hours left, gave them abysmal odds. He could not believe the innkeeper thought such a difficult ordeal was a game. To be fair, Lex himself was caught unaware by the number of zombies. When he was designing the games, he ensured that all zombies above the required level would be ejected from the game zone. Yet, while he tried to estimate how many zombies would be defending each point, he grossly underestimated the numbers. He expected that the devils may beef up defenses after they found out about the games, but this seemed a little too much. Fortunately, the game had an upper limit to the number of zombies based on the number of participants. Otherwise, if an army of 1,000,000 zombies showed up in one of the future games? Lex shuddered internally just thinking about it. As Alexander and his troops neared the zombies, he realized that the massive zombies could no longer be called a horde. From a random mix, the zombies had turned into an organized fighting force. Zombies with long range were mobilized in the back, protected by several groups of zombies, with a clear advantage in close combat. In the air, massive undead birds circled as they kept a close eye on the approaching prey. For better or worse, most definitely worse though, this was the enemy they had to face now. Still, everyone remained undeterred. As dangerous as zombies were, on the ladder of demons, they were at the very bottom, as Alexander had learnt in a crash course the Jotuns had provided him. Their individual fighting force was usually weaker than the average cultivator. So long as they approached this systematically, they could still win. A green flare went up in the sky, indicating that the Jotuns had begun their assault. Unlike Alexander and the other Earthlings who planned on using long-range combat to weaken the enemies, they directly charged in. Based on what Crawford, 41 told Alexander, considering their equipment and training, the Jotuns were expecting to go through the whole games without a single casualty. The limited time was truly the only difficulty they faced in this war. As advanced as they were, looking through a scope that aimed his newly assembled mortar, Alexander could not help but think the Jotuns were a bit pretentious. Why not use the advantage of technology? He fired the first shot, using actual physical ammunition this time, which prompted several other teams to fire as well. The Earthlings watched from a safe distance as the first of their artillery hit the zombies and, with the energy of a bunch of teenagers playing video games at midnight, started taking more shots. Even the 4,000 other Earthlings were taking a similar approach. Under the supervision of a few soldiers who were also trained as spirit tech engineers, the soldiers created a minimal version of a catapult. As primitive as the device seemed, its ammunition was the latest technology and pride of Uncle Sam. They loaded what looked like a moored mine into the catapult and fired freely. Relatively speaking, the massive metal ball flying through the air was slow and easy to target, which is exactly what the zombies did. Amongst the many other kinds of attacks, a bone spike was the first to hit the metal ball, and instead of a fiery explosion, the ball burst into hundreds of smaller balls that quickly fell into the crowd. The zombies made no effort to avoid the falling balls as they lacked the momentum to be dangerous, and just watched them when they finally landed on the ground. For a split second, it seemed as if nothing would happen. Then one of the balls released an annoyingly loud, sharp screech. As if activated by the sound, each of the balls suddenly absorbed a massive amount of spirit energy and launched towards the screeching ball, as if pulled by a magnetic force, and ripped through the zombies in their path. When all the balls finally reunited, they trembled, and then caused a massive spirit explosion. The force of the blast absolutely eviscerated all the zombies within 100 feet, and the traveling spirit shockwave killed many more zombies by crushing their zombie cores with an overload of spirit energy. Many things on Earth could be disputed, but no one could deny that the Americas had the greatest talent in making things explode. On the beast side, similar to the Jotun army, they decided on an upfront charge. The elephants took the lead, breaking through the zombie ranks, allowing the rest of the beasts to attack freely. At a glance, there seemed to be little to no tactic being employed by the beasts. Yet the truth was, with their incredible strength and defense, this was their best play to begin with. The wolves were close behind the elephants, and attacked with extreme prejudice. Despite lacking in technology, in the simplicity of their savagery, they were keeping up with the Earthlings in number of kills. In less than a minute, over 1,000 zombies were already dead by the combined armies. At the inn, the mood was extremely positive, as humans and beasts alike rooted for those they supported. Despite their initial intimidation, it seemed like the zombies were bound to lose. But as hopeful as Lex was that things would continue to play out this way, he doubted the devils would give up so easily. Perhaps if Pramod had not joined, Lex could believe that the trend for the battle was set, but he could not believe the devils had him join just to let the zombies be slaughtered so easily. Without even realizing it, they hit the 4-hour mark. At exactly this time, there was an announcement across the battlefield. 2 treasure chests have been placed at opposite ends of the battlefield. Each chest contains 100 tokens that will be absorbed by the first 100 contestants to reach them. One of the chests contains tokens that will fill the owning participants' endless spirit energy and physical stamina for the duration of this match, while the others will give the owner a secret advantage during the next game. The announcement ended as abruptly as it came, but the words had an abrupt reaction. The most immediate effect was on the soldiers, who were momentarily stunned by what they heard. But pausing in battle was extremely lethal, as the zombies did not bother to stop attacking, pushing them into a precarious situation. The second reaction was by the various commanders. The repercussions of the announcement had varying levels of effect, not only on this game, but on the next one as well. Most importantly, endless stamina and spirit energy would allow them to gain a massive number of points, while a secret advantage in the next game would also put them at an advantage. Almost as if it was rehearsed, all the armies immediately retreated. The announcement said that the chests were in opposite directions, but their specific location was unknown. Everyone sent out their scouts and drones. Even the flying zombies were sent out by Pramod to search for the chest. Only Alexander, who had satellites in the sky and got a live feed of the entire map, immediately knew where the chests were. By the next game, everyone would know about his satellites and he would lose the advantage, but for this game, they played a critical role. Immediately he set out towards the nearest one, while pretending to send out scouting units. Just as the mood on the battlefield had immediately changed, so too did the mood in the Colosseum when a man covered in blood came running in, wearing a look of panic. He looked around till he identified Fade, one of the 5 nascents, and ran towards him. The man tried to whisper, but those nearby, as well as Lex who had the power of the host attire, heard him when he said, "War has broken out on Earth." Chapter 153 Refugees. Sitting cross-legged on the floor in the very center of the zombie horde, Pramod looked at the vile organ in his hand. It looked like a beating heart, but instead of muscle and tissue, it seemed to be made of rotting leaves and bark. His one and only mission was to kill as many humans and beasts, all if at all possible. Originally, his plan was to use this cursed caably heart on his enemies after they had been worn out after fighting the zombies endlessly, but the 2 treasure chests presented another opportunity. If he could manage to get to the endless spirit energy, during this round he could kill as many as possible with his own 2 hands, and save the heart for the next game. Or maybe, if he got an advantage for the next game, he could use it to set up traps. Either way, there was not too much pressure on him. The devil that had commanded him had given him the mission, but also told him to treat these games as a training opportunity since the nodes would be lost regardless of the situation. With no pressure for success or failure, he could do as he pleased. So for now, he waited. As soon as his birds informed him of the location of the chests, he would make a drastic move. The loss of a little over 10,000 zombies in the past hour did not faze him in the slightest, and he continued to sit on the ground as if he were meditating in a park. A few dozen feet below him, the node was hidden in an underground base. A part of him also wondered, if he destroyed the node himself and gained all the points, would it be worth it? Would the prize still go to the planet Vegas Minima, or would it go to the devils? Lex was slightly confused when he heard the panicked man's whisper. What did he mean war had broken down on Earth? War, even in this modern day and age, was not necessarily rare on Earth. Without taking any sides on the matter, there were many conflicts not only between what was described as the West and the East, many countries had high tensions with their neighbors. An embarrassingly long list of countries' names flashed through Lex's mind when he thought of countries it would be troublesome to be neighbors with. This was also only considering the affairs of the so-called mortals. Large-scale war between cultivators had also been curtailed by the ICPAs. Yet before the man could explain more to Fade, or Lex could come up with a plausible explanation, the familiar ring of a new quest rang in Lex's mind. New quest, you have encountered a special event called World War. All guests coming from the planet experiencing the World War will have a period of 70% discount on all expenses. All guests below the age of 15 will have a 99% discount on all expenses. As the most prestigious establishment in the universe, the Midnight Inn must be a safe haven during troubled times. Host as many refugees as possible. Quest time limit, duration of World War. Quest reward, subject to number of refugees hosted. Remarks, some things are worth more than MP, such as a good reputation. Scam everyone till you get it. Lex froze when he read the quest, and his shock was so huge that even the host attire wasn't able to stop his body from tensing up. Though no one dared to scan the innkeeper with their spiritual sense, many had their focus on him at all times. Let alone Remy and Akihiko, who were sitting beside him, the mystery devil along with a number of other prominent guests noticed the anomaly in the innkeeper's behavior immediately. Lex snap out of it, Mary roared in his mind, quickly snapping him back to his natural state. Yet the damage was already done. Many people started wondering what had happened to elicit a reaction from the innkeeper. They started replaying scenes from the games, wondering if something had happened there. A few people wondered if his reaction had to do with something that happened at the inn. The mysterious devil, whose senses were by far the strongest here, naturally overheard the words the bloody man had whispered. For a moment he considered if that was the reason, but then dismissed it. There was a delay of several seconds between the words and his reaction. At their level, even a single second could be stretched to fit a billion thoughts, let alone a few of them, so it was unlikely. What he did not know was that the delay in reaction was because Lex was listening to his new quest. Such a simple misunderstanding had saved Lex from revealing a huge secret, yet no one realized it. But even as Lex had recovered his composure slightly, his mind was in chaos. What did the system mean by a world war? What was happening? There was no indication of this whatsoever beforehand. He was not worried about anyone else at this moment except his family. He had been waiting to bring them to the inn because he wanted to become stronger first, but how could have anticipated such a situation? A million thoughts ran through his head before he calmed down. At this moment, he could not give a rat's ass about maintaining his facade. His focus was entirely on the bloody man's words as he explained the situation and thought of what he could do. At first, they cut the connection to the internet, then the power. Communications were severely compromised, so we had to wait for the backup generators and private communication channels to understand what was happening. All governments are already under their control. Many countries' militaries tried to put up a fight, but they were either quickly defeated or their leaders were captured. Dozens of sects are taking part in this, and from what it seems like, so are the ICPAs. Anyone who could put up a strong resistance has either been detained or killed. Nuclear facilities have fallen and many holy lands have lost control of their formations. And this is just the bits and pieces of information we were able to gather before we lost communication. All key points worldwide have been taken over. Civilians haven't been hurt so far, or at least, the ones who didn't try to fight back haven't. Lex, you need to be clear-headed, Mary said loudly in his mind, attracting his attention. Your greatest asset is the system and the inn. You need to maintain their power and prestige. On Earth, you have no contacts, no power and no say. If you're worried about your family, well, to be completely honest, unless you use the inn, there's nothing you can do for them. So don't break character and don't let anyone know the Innkeeper is interested in Earth. It will only spell trouble for you. Lex grimaced, but eventually acknowledged what Mary said. Thank you, is all he said to her. He needed to clear his head and understand the situation clearly, only then could he react appropriately. While chaos was beginning to spread across Earth, and among their representatives at the inn, Alexander had already reached the first chest. After leaving sight of the other armies, he had headed in a straight line at maximum speed, not caring to preserve his spirit energy or stamina, and he was rewarded accordingly. Without any suspense, and with none the wiser, Alexander opened the first chest and felt a token latch onto his arm. Spirit energy coursed through his body, completely refreshing him. He felt a special artificial film coat his meridians, preventing them from suffering any wear or tear due to the excessive amount of spiritual energy. The feeling was more intoxicating than any drug, and yes, Alexander had tried various drugs, under supervision of course, that he had ever experienced. For a while, he even forgot what he was supposed to be doing. But the feeling passed, and the boy recovered. He opened his map to check the location of the second chest, and to see if any of the armies were near it. Preferably, he wanted the second one as well. To his horror, he saw that nearly 80% of the zombie horde was moving towards the second chest, and had nearly reached it. There was no way Alexander would be able to get the other chest. Suddenly, his eyes narrowed as he had an idea. All units assume bulldozer formation and await my return. The node is vulnerable, we have to destroy it before the others return. As the 99 soldiers who were with him also recovered from the euphoria of the endless spirit energy, he gave the order for them to return. Activating his body technique to the absolute maximum, Alexander rocketed towards his destination, his gold aura shining brighter than ever before. Chapter 154 Nuclear Deterrent. As nonchalant as Brandon usually was, even he was not smiling right now. He'd had a strong feeling that something would happen during the games, but despite all their investigations, they yielded no results. Now it seemed the answer was in front of them. It was impossible for such a massive conspiracy to be hidden from all 5 families, unless the members of each family were also involved in them. It seemed they had suppressed everyone's ambitions for too long. He was sitting in a room with the other families' heads. The bloody man was present as well, and had been thoroughly interrogated. To ensure the truth of what he was saying, the family heads had sent back several of their assistants and followers back to Earth, but none of them had returned yet. That in itself was information enough. The fact that we returned to Earth from the exact place we left is a big flaw, Richard finally said. It lets the enemy prepare a trap for us in advance. There is no point in delaying this. Even if there are traps, what can they do to us? We just need to return and take care of anyone who gets in our way. Matters are already beyond that. Do you even know who you can trust? Who will you take care of once you return? How many people will you kill as a demonstration? You know, the whole point of leaving us in charge was to avoid chaos. If we go back and start killing everyone who resists us, what will we do when they become dissatisfied? Silence filled the room once again. From the moment they had started the meeting, none of them had been able to come to a conclusion on what to do. The truth was, everyone was just evading the problem as long as they could, because once they did, it was likely they would have to kill their own kin. Other than Brandon, who was only 104 years old, the rest were a fair bit older, though they did their best to hide their ages. They lacked the youthful vigor required to tackle difficult situations. Just as they were about to begin arguing again, Richard's personal hologram appeared before him. Excuse me for disturbing you, but your granddaughter Celine is trying to reach you. Would you like to allow her into the room? Yes, let her in, he said quickly. Celine had been on Earth and had not joined him for the games, so her presence here was a great relief. But it also left a hint of dread in his heart. What if she was the one who betrayed him? The girl that entered no longer had her prior grace and elegance, instead her face was painted with anxiety. The moment she saw her grandfather, she handed him a letter, unsure of her voice to communicate effectively at this moment. Richard read the letter, his body trembling in anger as read the words, until he reached the end, when his shoulders slumped in defeat. "The letter is from my nephew," Richard said, passing it to the others. "That 10 nuclear devices have been planted in cities across the world. They have all of our locations of departure from Earth under surveillance. If any of the family heads return to Earth, they will set off 2 nuclear devices for each family head. Someone will come to the inn to negotiate with us in a few hours, until then we've been instructed to stay here." His words chilled everyone's hearts. It not only confirmed their worst fears about being betrayed by their families, it put them in a position where they could take no chances. Unless someone could prove to them that there were no nuclear devices ready, with the people of Earth as hostages, the family heads were unable to do anything. Furthermore, from the inn they could not even communicate with the mysterious lady they talked to previously and let her know of the situation. All they could do now was wait. Lex, who had been spying in on the meeting, grimaced. Originally, his knowledge about the politics of Earth had been very limited, but occasionally, whenever he found free time, he would spy on these high-leveled Earthlings to learn more about his planet. He had a basic understanding of the 5 families, and now concluded that the so-called World War was a result of their family members revolting against the leaders. He didn't care much for their internal strife, but if any of his family members got hurt as a result of this, he would make them pay dearly. In this moment, Lex learnt something about himself. He never realized it, but he had a very serious anger issue, and when thinking of all the things he would do to them should his family get implicated, he was a strong believer in revenge. Somewhere on Earth, in what looked like a very modern version of the Taj Mahal, Christine and Vera Joel stood close together, whispering amongst themselves. Around them were various security guards and only a few other people who were dressed casually. Among those dressed casually was Aisha Shezad, looking forlorn. "Are you sure about this?" Christine asked her daughter nervously. Yes, trust me." "Well, I'm not so sure about you, but I've already determined that I'll be absolutely safe here," Vera answered with too much honesty. "We just need to wait out the month, then we can leave this desolate planet." "I hope you're right," Christine answered bitterly. Suddenly, Vera turned her head towards a wall, a smirk suddenly appearing on her face. It appeared as though she was looking at nothing, but a few rooms away in that direction, one of the guards started making a report about the sudden war to a hologram of a woman. It was the same woman the 5 family heads reported to. Alexander had no knowledge of what was happening on Earth and had his entire attention focused on the task before him. If all went according to plan, not only would this game end earlier than the 12-hour mark, he would take a huge lead on the number of points. He and his 99 soldiers were running at maximum speed, radiating spirit energy far and wide for anyone to sense. But even if they were noticed, it would make no difference now as they had already taken the tokens. Despite running at his utmost speed and using as much energy as he could, Alexander had never felt better. Imagine doing the most arduous physical task your body could endure without dying. Now imagine being able to repeatedly do that task without fatigue or danger of hurting yourself. That was how Alexander was feeling. All he was really doing right now was running. Well, he was doing more than running. He was the beacon that led his troops to battle, the tip of the spear that would pierce the enemy, the front of the vanguard that would clear the path for those who followed. His idea was simple. He and his 99 troops would charge through the zombies and continuously bombard the node with the strongest, most deadly and destructive weapons they had. With unlimited spirit energy, they were literally experiencing video game cheats in real life. The first of the zombies entered his line of sight, and he entered theirs. By the time the zombies realized it was not a ball of golden flame approaching them but a person, he was already upon them. Cutting through the horde like a bullet through a loaf of bread, Alexander has his destination marked. As he laughed in mirth at the wonderful feeling of endless power, his troops began a coordinated assault on the horde. But in this scenario where their brains were slightly overstimulated by the endless euphoria, coordination simply meant screaming, "Watch how many I kill in this direction," before throwing their strongest attack that would usually leave them completely drained. As ridiculously as the situation had become, those who were still watching the match realized that these troops may have slightly lost their sanity. But who cared? It made for an entertaining show. Alexander reached the center of what remained of the horde to realize he could not see the node. Was it hidden somewhere? While he analyzed the situation, his 6 blades spun around him like a saw with a ferocity never before seen, slicing anything that tried to come close. Underground maybe, Alexander thought to himself and looked down. It was at that exact moment the ground burst open and an armored hand reached for his leg. Alexander leaped out of the way, but the hand was faster and longer than he expected. The 7-foot-tall demon revealed himself, the scaly armor adorning his body free from any dirt despite coming out of the ground, and caught hold of the teenager. Before Alexander could do anything to protect himself, Pramod used Alexander's body like a hammer and smashed him into the ground. It was impossible to tell under the helmet, but the viewers got the sensation that Pramod was grinning. Chapter 155 expected more. There were numerous battles taking place in the games, mainly around the second chest. It was a frantic free-for-all, yet despite their best efforts, the chest remained in the control of the zombie horde that seemed to be slowly taking it back towards the center. The elephants met their match in zombies 10 feet tall, the wolves were stalled by the zombies with tentacles, the humans slowed down by a special breed of zombies that could dig into the ground. It truly was a spectacle. Near the center of the map, 99 fearless soldiers were launching repeated attacks out of what looked like rocket launchers, as if they would never run out of ammo. The truth was, these weapons were powered by spirit energy, so under their current circumstances, they really wouldn't run out of ammo. That, accompanied by their overly excited emotions due to the excess energy running through their brains, resulted in a situation where they were fighting the hordes like kids in a video game instead of backing up Alexander, who was deeper in. Yet despite all that, at this particular moment, most people who were still watching the games had their attention turned towards Alexander. The first time he was smashed into the ground, he became completely disoriented, the golden aura around him vanishing and the air knocked completely out of him. But that was only the beginning. Pramod did not slow his movements, and started smashing Alexander around like a rag doll. With a grip tight enough to crumple steel clamping onto the teenager's leg, he swung him over his own head and smashed him into the ground. Once. Twice. Thrice. As he was about to smash Alexander into the ground the fourth time without any resistance, people had begun to suspect him already dead, but that is when the 6 blades that had fallen onto the ground flew into the air, aiming to pierce through Pramod's hand. Originally, the giant demon meant to ignore the blades, as he had every confidence in his scaly armor, but when the first blade cut into his forearm, the demon had no choice but to release Alexander and retreat. The demon stared at his bleeding arm with a mix of pain and fascination, giving the beaten teenager some time to pick himself up. Even as Alexander wobbled to his feet, his head was spinning and he could not think straight. For the first time in a long, long time, Alexander had been taken completely by surprise and was disoriented. Before his infinite physical stamina helped him completely recover, Pramod decided to attack him once again. But things did not go according to plan. Even without the ability of coherent thought, this was not Alexander's first time in battle. His instincts were honed through hours of endless combat and expert training. His 6 blades, still as sharp and lethal as ever, immediately attacked Pramod the moment he moved towards Alexander. The few seconds they delayed him were enough for Alexander to barely recover. He no longer looked like a handsome youth, straight out from the cover of a magazine. Messy hair and a layer of dirt on his face were the least of his worries. He was suffering from a broken nose, several hairline fractures in his ribs and probably a severely messed up leg. Whether the bone was crushed or not could still be debated, but his muscles and tendons were surely ruptured. But even as he raised his hands towards his face to pop his nose back into place, Alexander wore a messy grin. What had he cultivated his body for if not to be able to handle such injuries, if not worse ones? This was not even taking into consideration how quickly he would be able to heal with his endless spirit energy. Dat wash gooch, he said, before frowning. After wiggling his tongue around in his mouth for a second and discovering the problem, he spit out a few broken teeth. That was a good surprise you gave me there, he said once again, his accent only slightly changed due to his missing teeth. I don't even remember the last time I suffered a concussion. It was not aimed towards you specifically, Pramod said, his voice surprisingly mild and sweet, as if he was a kid. But I'm glad I came across you. With your annoying stoic face and attitude that says the whole world revolves around you, you were really beginning to annoy me. I'll thoroughly enjoy taking you down. Alexander grinning, and looked at the massive demon in front of him. The teenager himself had not yet reached 6 feet in height, so he had to turn his head upwards, but his demeanor screamed as if he was still looking down at Pramod. For a moment, he considered exchanging a few more lines with his opponent, then decided to directly get on with it. The golden aura around Alexander returned, and he charged towards the demon. The 6 blades flew into the air, distancing themselves from the two, but kept their aim directed towards Pramod. Even without doing anything, the threat of being attacked from 6 different directions was very real, even for Pramod, but the most pressing threat was the sword in Alexander's hand. But the demon did not shy away. A purple aura wrapped itself around the demon's hands as it directly slapped the sword away, directly pushing Alexander aside. Promode's massive brute strength was already dangerous enough, but the purple aura had a corrosive effect on the sword as well. Alexander had to quickly use his own spirit energy to wash away the lingering purple aura, only to find his sword had dulled slightly from the middle. Alexander ducked, still looking at his sword, just in time to dodge a massive palm, and stepped closer towards the demon's body. Using both his arms, he swung his sword upward, slashing at the demon's neck. The demon dodged nimbly, its speed not at all affected by its hulking body. The two exchanged moves, each more lethal than the next, doing their best to kill one another. Yet despite their speed and impressive skill, so far all their techniques had been limited to simple augmentation types. Alexander augmented his sword's lethality, while the demon did so for his hands. The human teenager was the first to break the pattern, a golden bolt of energy escaping from the tip of his sword just as it passed Promode's face after a dodge. Alexander was already readying his next move for when the demon dodged but, unexpectedly, the bolt hit it directly in the face. Promode yelled as he fell backwards. Immediately, Alexander took advantage of the moment and directly attacked. Unable to deflect the attack skillfully, as he had been doing before, Promode released a massive burst of purple energy from his palm, blasting the sword out of Alexander's hand. For a moment, it seemed the demon had managed to protect himself. Then, one of Alexander's blades that had long been forgotten pierced through the demon's neck from the back. Through the helmet that the massive demon wore, Alexander could only see its eyes showing surprise mixed with horror. Then another one of his blades cut through the demon's neck, and another, until the head was cut clean off from the body. Back at the inn, everyone sat frozen at the sudden conclusion of the fight. It had only just begun. Where was the desperate battle? Where were the hidden techniques? How could it end so quickly? Was that all there really was to the demon commander? Either his end was extremely anticlimactic, or this Alexander was much stronger than he seemed. The kids from Troy Academy burst into cheers, waking up the rest from their reverie. In her room, Loretta continued to watch the screen with a placid look. It did not appear as if she cared about Promode's demise. To be honest, I was expecting more, Alexander said, as he looked down at the demon's detached head. There were still things he held in reserve. He was just getting warmed up. But this was a good reminder to him. Life wasn't always like a movie. You wouldn't always get a long, drawn-out battle. A moment's carelessness could prematurely decide even an expert's fate. Using all his physical and spiritual strength, Alexander suddenly moved to the side as dread suddenly filled his heart, but it was barely enough. A sword, his discarded sword, pierced through Alexander's back and through his chest, puncturing his left lung. The crowds at the inn, humans and beast alike, froze as they saw the scene. Behind Alexander stood a headless body. To be honest, I expected more, Alexander heard a sweet voice. His eyes bent downwards at the head to see its eyes staring back at the body. His expression did not need to be seen, just from the look in his eyes, one could tell he was grinning. Chapter 156. Let me give it a try. No, a scream echoed through the inn, accompanied by a horror-stricken Helen. She did not know when she stood up, nor did she realize that she had screamed. All she felt currently was panic so deep it and firmly grasped her heart. Even Lex, who had been marinating in his own endless anger, was woken up from his thoughts by her yell. He was startled again to see Alexander on his screen, standing with a sword running through his chest. Absolutely pathetic, the head said, as its body left the sword in Alexander's body and approached it. For all your arrogance and bravado, I expected a better fight. But you fell so easily for the first trick I used. Although I must give you props for moving out of the way just enough to protect your heart. The demon picked up the head and reattached it to its body, now looking down upon Alexander, who was still standing in the same posture he had been stabbed in. But then again, it was my own fault for expecting so much from such a pathetic species as humans. How can you even begin to imagine my power? You probably thought I was dead after you cut my head off. But I'm not a low-level demon like the zombies. I'm a nightmare demon, understand? I'm immortal. With that the demon burst into a fit of laughter. It seemed like he was enjoying talking down to Alexander, but the truth was the demon was only casually chatting while its head properly reattached to its body. A being such as that really was outside the understanding of humans. Even the guests at the inn or the Jotun soldiers had a dark expression on their faces. Alexander was someone who had attracted a lot of attention, and his current condition left a bitter taste in the mouth. But compared to a demon that could live even after getting its head chopped off, let alone Alexander, all humans looked weak and insignificant. What inherent power did humans have? What was their strong suit? If they did not cultivate, humans were so weak that a fall down a small flight of stairs could end their lives. All humans were really good at was adapting. They could understand the rules of the world around them, and since they could not bend the rules, they could use them to their own advantage. They could fashion weapons out of wood, make utensils out of stone. They could grow crops in the dirt and predict the weather from the wind. Even if they advanced enough to build a civilization advanced enough to fly in the sky and travel through the stars, all their accomplishments were external. They could harness the energy of the universe to make the most complex of tools to aid them, but in the absence of those tools, they were still weak. They could not reattach their own severed heads the way the demon had. Of course, if humans ever gained the ability to directly interact with and control energy themselves, instead of just taking advantage of their understanding of how energy normally behaved, what they could possibly accomplish was unimaginable. "Relax, girl," a calm voice washed over Helen, attracting her attention from the nightmare on screen. Behind her stood Audrey, Alexander's grandmother. "My grandson is not so easy to kill." Helen was taken aback by the old woman's seemingly calm attitude. If Brandon were not in a meeting and saw the current situation, his reaction would not be much different from Audrey's. They had unwavering faith, not only in their grandson, but in the life-threatening training he had undergone his whole life. They had confidence even more so because what was spirit energy if not a supreme form of energy, and what was cultivation if not controlling and manipulating that energy? Pramod continued to give a condescending speech, not at all noticing that the golden aura around Alexander had not diminished at all, unlike the last time he had taken Alexander by surprise. If anything, the color seemed to be getting richer. If one could see into Alexander's body on a microscopic level, they would notice millions upon millions of nanobots repairing the wounds in Alexander's body. The nanobots gathered in clumps around where the blade pierced his lungs, preventing blood from entering them as well as getting ready to seal the wound as soon as the sword was removed. But that was not all. Normally, when a human healed, his cells would undergo a division to replace the lost or damaged cells. But there was a limit to how many times a cell would divide during a person's lifetime. However, there was a technique used by cultivators who practiced both their body and spiritual cultivation at the same time, which would use up all the spiritual energy in a person's body not only to force the cells to split, but undergo a rejuvenation which would actually increase the number of times the cells could split. That was only one aspect of the technique called Buddha's grace, and the technique was a lot more complicated than that. It was meant to be used when one was critically injured, and would allow the person to heal just enough to survive a little longer. That was because, normally, the amount of spirit energy a person wielded was limited. But what if there was unlimited spiritual energy? And what if the body would not be exhausted no matter how much it healed itself? By now, even some of the guests noticed that the teenager who had a sword hanging out from both sides of his body was still standing, while he should have fallen down a long time ago. Immortality, a single word from Alexander's lips interrupted Pramod's speech, who suddenly woke up to the fact that the humans still had not keeled over and died. "It sounds interesting. Let me give it a try." He grabbed onto the blade protruding from his chest and slowly pushed it back out, all the while maintaining eye contact. When the sword was pushed all the way out and fell to the ground, only a small amount of blood squirted out of the wound before a metallic sheen covered the wound. If people didn't know better, they would assume that instead of a human, a robot stood before them. "While I'm at it, let me put your immortality to the test," he said with gritted teeth, a twinge of anger coming through. He was putting on a brave face, but only he knew how close he actually came to death. If his heart had been punctured instead of his lung, while he could have continued to live, he would not have been able to move. The demon could have easily finished him off. Right now, his body was still healing and using a tremendous amount of spiritual energy while at it. The more energy that he burned, the darker the surrounding aura became. Without any words, the two suddenly launched towards each other and clashed, fist against fist. They had prepared to smash each other to bits, but a small spark from their first clash completely ignited the aura around Alexander. Instead of gold, he now appeared to be covered in flame, but he did not slow down even for a moment. An ungodly amount of strength flowed through his arms as he punched the demon's face, determined to see if he could still live after he squished it to a pulp. While Alexander himself still remained unaware of the fire surrounding him, the guests, and especially Pramod, were extremely aware of its awesome power. The strength of Alexander's augmented fists could be dulled by his armor, but the heat of the flame seemed to reach directly into his being. Pramod roared as his ominous purple aura exploded around him, but before he could use it to his advantage, 6 flaming blades attacked him from different angles. Pramod barely defended himself, but his aura was eviscerated. Alexander did not give him any time to rest, though. He raised his right hand in the air, and the 6 blades oriented themselves right beside it. Small yellow balls of light floated out of his fingers and started collecting at the tip of each blade. Influenced by the blazing glory of the flame around the teenager, the balls slowly became alight. Normally this would be a slow process, but the rate at which Alexander was burning spirit energy sped up the process so that in a couple of seconds, 6 flaming balls hung in the air. This was the technique he had learnt from John, called Final Glory, meant to be used as a last resort that would normally drain him of all his spirit energy. Alexander did not care much for the name, but its effect was truly amazing. Alexander pointed his hand at Pramod and shot the blades towards the demon as if out of a bazooka. Each blade passed through the flaming ball, absorbing its energy as it passed. Pramod immediately sensed the threat and let out a ferocious roar before slamming the ground. A wall of dust rose into the air, hiding the demon from view, but that did not prevent the now flaming blades from reaching him. 6 earth-shattering explosions rocked the entire small pocket dimension, immediately attracting the attention of each participant. They looked towards the center, wondering what had happened. But while everyone was feeling a mix of shock and awe and reverie, Alexander cracked his neck a couple of times before he slowly started walking towards the dust cloud. Who knew immortals could make such great punching bags? An angry and crazed roar responded to his casual remark, but he did not care. 6 blades were floating around his right arm again, gathering 6 balls of flame, as he prepared his next round of attacks. Today, he would beat the crap out of an immortal. Chapter 157 First game ends. The crowd at the inn was going wild. They enjoyed the twists and turns in each fight, swooned as they saw the various weapons on display. Alexander's fight was just one of many. Quite a few had managed to make a name for themselves. A few outstanding beasts attracted a lot of attention, and naturally many of the humans. The Jotun soldiers did not dazzle with ostentatious displays, but their extremely consistent and steady performance was an award winner. Even up until now, they had not suffered a single casualty. The participants themselves, though, had a very different mindset. Most of them were extremely tired. Large-scale battles were very different from small-scale fights, and they had to balance their physical and spiritual stamina, something that not many were trained for. The mental fatigue had also started to wear them down. But despite all of that, they had around 5 hours left, and somewhere between 15 to 20,000 zombies still standing. They didn't even want to kill the zombies, they just wanted to get their hands on the treasure chest the horde was quickly escorting back, but just that seemed a momentous task. And if they weren't able to do this much, destroying the node would be even harder. But little did they know, the node was almost destroyed simply by accident. Pramod, battered and beaten, kept trying to lure Alexander away from the center. For a while now, he had just been using devastatingly powerful attacks that threatened to destroy the node just by attacking the vicinity near it. He himself was bleeding from all over, and his armor seemed destroyed in many places. But he truly did not care about the damage he was taking. In a sense, he had not lied when he said he was immortal. Such attacks, no matter how many times he received, would never kill him. Of course, he would not explain that to Alexander. The only thing on his mind now was to hold Alexander off long enough till his zombies brought the treasure chest to him. After that, he would let Alexander destroy the node because the truth was he had realized it was impossible for him to actually kill Alexander right now. While all of this was happening, Lex had calmed down now and was watching the game with a critical eye. He did not know enough about cultivation to understand the complexities of the techniques and abilities being used, but the one thing he could understand very clearly was his own inferiority. As of late, he had been getting slightly arrogant with all the influence he held at the inn. People older and stronger than him hung on his every word, and he made decisions arbitrarily. In brainwashing himself to seem more confident for his performance, he had at some point really started believing himself something great. But all it took was a single crisis on Earth to bring him back to reality. As much influence as he had at the inn, outside of it he was nothing. His personal strength was weak, and Lex Williams' connections were all for naught. He was so caught up in avoiding trouble on Earth that when trouble came, he had no one he could ask for help. Even his connection with Marlowe he had terminated. But this realization did not mean he was indulging in self-pity. Far from it, in fact. He was waking up to the cold hard truth, so that he could remedy it. If he stayed within his delusions, a simple accident was all it would take to cause him irreparable damage. With his self-actualization achieved, he needed to decide what to do next. He already put up a commission for items to heal the soul or information about it, so now in that regard all he could do is wait. Much more importantly, Lex was worried about his family. Without moving a muscle, he used his ability to put up another commission in the guild room for detailed information about the situation in London, which is where his family was currently staying. He also put up another commission for general information about the details behind what was happening on Earth. Once he had enough information, he would then decide what to do. His greatest power and asset was the inn and its influence, and he intended to use it fully. Currently, his attention was split between the family heads and the games. They seemed to be waiting for someone, which was good enough. The moment they learned anything, so would he. And in case his family was in trouble, he would hold events, put up commissions, offer jobs, give out trials, whatever it took to make sure they'd be safe. Lex, you're getting angry again, Mary said softly, waking him from his thoughts. She was sitting on his shoulder, looking at him with a little bit of pity. Lately she had spent less and less time with him, because she realized she could not help herself but give him recommendations. That in itself was not a bad thing, but he needed to learn how to make decisions based on whatever information he had himself. After all, if her way of doing things was so great, she wouldn't be. Thanks, Lex muttered, and turned his attention back to the game. He needed to keep himself occupied. Back in the game, the horde had neared Promote enough that he completely ignored Alexander and sprinted towards the horde. He couldn't let the human realize that the horde had the chest, or he would use his overwhelming firepower to steal it. From Alexander's point of view, it merely seemed like Promote was running away. Initially, he thought to chase after him, but by now even he had realized that despite doing a lot of damage, he was unable to kill the demon. And with various other forces chasing close behind the horde, Alexander decided it was a better idea to look for and destroy the node before they arrived. He didn't know which of them was able to get the prize, but it hardly mattered to him anymore. Squads 1 and 2, before Alexander could continue to give orders, he realized that his earpiece had fallen out or had been destroyed at some point. He could not communicate with his soldiers, so he would have to figure this out on his own. Right now, he had no equipment or weapons other than his blades, so it would be a little hard to determine the location of the node. His emotions, in the heightened state that they were in, made it difficult for him to make a detailed plan, so he went with the most basic and brutal one. He started bombarding the ground with an endless barrage of final glory. The ground shattered and quaked as his attacks landed. Each attack brought about its own cloud of dust and dirt to the point where Alexander felt like a smoke machine, but he did not stop. And, just like that, in the stupidest way possible, one of his attacks finally reached deep enough and hit the node, destroying it. A siren rang throughout the battlefield before the Innkeeper's voice was heard, full of energy and mirth. Congratulations to Alexander Morrison for single-handedly destroying the first node, and kicking off the games in such a splendid way. The rest of you performed remarkably as well. Why don't we get you some well-deserved rest? With that, all the participants were covered by a protective bubble, and teleported back to the inn. Since many of them were in combat, when they returned, they were spaced far apart so as to not accidentally harm one another. The sudden change caught many of them with surprise, and most of them felt frustrated rather than relieved that the game was over. After all their hard work, the points for the node had been single-handedly snatched by Alexander. Of course, the other Earthlings were ecstatic. Though they separated from Alexander, his points would ultimately count towards Earth's total as well. Followed by the feeling of frustration, they were hit by exhaustion. The next game was supposed to be in around 17 hours, which was definitely not enough time to completely rest up. This was not even considering those of them that had been wounded. But of course, since they could think this far, so could Lex, and he had already taken care of it. To all the contestants, I recommend you return to your allocated bases and get some rest. The housing in each base has been fitted with the healing capabilities of the recovery room, so that all remaining participants will be in tip-top shape for the next match. The participants, too tired to think about anything else, started marching back towards their bases to get some rest. The sounds of hooting and cheering from the Colosseum made a nice backdrop to their return, but while most Earthling participants were reveling in their victory, Alexander was staring at his grandmother. His grandfather was missing, and so were the other family heads. Something must have happened. Something bad. Chapter 158. What the hell? The hours after the game ended passed in a much-needed lull, at least for the guests. After watching for several hours straight, despite the excellent excitement, they were getting tired. Many chose to stay in their rooms to sleep, some decided to return to their respective planets. Those that returned to Earth soon received a big surprise. Everyone had plans to return to watch the next match, but how many would actually return was yet to be determined. Will Bentham was one of the guests who had decided to stay at the inn. Truth be told, he was seriously considering living at the inn perpetually, as the air on Earth was too putrid for him to tolerate after spending time in this heaven. This plan of his was slowly starting to seem more likely because he had placed a nominal sum as a bet to show support for Alexander. Keeping in mind the lad's excellent performance, he had received a whopping 11,000 MP as credit. This solidified his plan to continue betting, small amounts of course, and could use that money to supplement his plans. Not that he was really short of money, but he had never disliked a sudden windfall. While Will had become an unexpected winner, most people had lost their bets, including Anthony, who had placed a personal bet that the Jotuns would be the ones to destroy the node. Since this was the first match, people had bet only small amounts, as they did not know what to expect from the participants. The next match would likely be when the real betting began. Despite that, Lex had made a spectacular 330,765 MP profit from the bets alone. Something worth noting was that other than Will, Ijashima won nearly 8,000 MP in bets. Oddly enough, his prizes didn't come from a single win, but from various random bets. It seemed as if the tree did not understand the concept of gambling very well and randomly placed bets on whoever it thought looked good. Other than that, his income from food and other services was only 440,765 MP since about 15,000 of the mouths he was feeding were participating in the games. Even though he was not really in the mood to pay attention to these things, he could not help but remember just a month back when he was struggling to raise a measly 10,000 MP. In comparison, his current total was 981,530 MP. But he did not touch the MP this time. He planned no upgrades and didn't think of fixing any issues. This MP would stay in reserve for now in case he needed to use it for any particular reason. He spent his time meditating back in his room and told Mary to inform him when the people who were going to negotiate with the family heads came. While Lex was meditating, a lot of people were waiting in anxiously. Brandon, of course, had already cooled down and was spending time with his grandson, laughing at his reaction when Alexander finally learnt about the golden aura. As it turned out, Brandon had specially modified the technique so the user would not be able to see the aura. It was the only way to have people actually practice the technique all the way. Helen sat quietly in the corner. Since she learned about the war, she had not spoken a word. Anthony was having all the data analyzed and discussing the strategy for the next match with Crawford, 41. It was confirmed now that Pramod had been able to get his hands on the second chest, which would likely make the next match incredibly hard. He had also sent someone to invite the leaders from Earth to discuss the strategy, but apparently they were preoccupied at the moment. By now, as dismissive as he was of Earth, he at least recognized they were not completely worthless. He had even sent a clip of Alexander's battle to Ragnar back on Vegas Minima. Speaking of which, the bubble surrounding the first battlefield had disappeared once all the contestants retreated. Ragnar immediately secured the location and had his troops try to locate any remnants of the node. If they could understand it better, they would be able to search for it themselves on the other planets. The beasts were undergoing their own form of strategy meetings. They had racked up a decent number of points, but not enough. The sloth was having a few discussions with the various leaders from the planet about how they can improve performance. The consensus, generally, was that during the first 5 games, they only needed to get a decent number of points. It was the last 5 games during which they would steal the show. Like this, the time passed and just as the first light of the new day shone down on the inn, 3 new guests appeared at the inn. In the lead was a woman, and behind her 2 men. This was the first time they had come to the inn and took a look around. When their personal holograms showed up and introduced them to the rules and asked if they needed help with anything, they were particularly impressed. This is a good place. If I can cultivate here, I feel like I'll be able to break through in just a few months, said the man with short, blonde hair. We need to find out more about this inn. If we can cultivate our forces here. Focus on the task at hand, the woman said in a tired voice. She was exhausted from babysitting these 2. Why couldn't hidden co-conspirators be more serious, like in the movies? Little did she know, her 2 partners were thinking the same thing about her. She had an unusual form of OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, wherein she could only focus on one task. Anything at all that was not completely relevant to that task would irritate her to no end, and she would, in turn, irritate them to no end. Fine, let's just get on with it. The 3 asked their holographic assistants to escort them to the family heads. As soon as they met someone from the entourage from one of the families, they were escorted to a room for a meeting. Mary naturally woke Lex up so he could pay attention. In the room, 4 of the family heads and a few other relevant dignitaries were staring at the 3 newcomers with murder in their eyes. The 3 of them were quite nonchalant about it though, they already knew about the security provided by the inn. Don't look at me like that, Grandpappy Sam. What will you do if I get scared and run away? Asked the blonde man sarcastically. You have some gall to speak to me like that, Kevin. The blonde man only chuckled and ignored the senile fool. So you really have betrayed us, said Richard, looking at the other man. Is it really a betrayal, old man? The way I see it, we just took our inheritance a little before you died. It's not a big deal. You disappoint me, Lee. The feeling is mutual, he said, as he comfortably took a seat. To be honest, Lee felt like annoying these geezers a little more, but he could tell the preamble conversation was already irritating Miranda, and he'd had a long day taking over the world. He didn't want to hear her bickering. Were all families involved? The Queen asked Miranda. Does it matter? That's not what we're here to discuss. Someone hurry up and call Brandon so we can begin. Ho ho, I didn't know you were missing me so much, rang Brandon's voice as he appeared close behind Miranda. She didn't know if she was imagining it, but she could feel his warmth behind her. Despite herself, Miranda blushed. Then Audrey appeared in the room and pulled the century-old playboy to his seat, pulled him by the ear, of course. The other family heads felt stifled. They didn't know if they were angrier at their descendants who had appeared before them or this stupid old man who had somehow completely stopped caring that the earth was being taken over. "Let's begin," Miranda said, sitting down, her gaze still lingering on Brandon. He had gotten a few new tattoos since the last time she saw him. Miranda gulped as she suppressed her wandering thoughts and regained composure. To help her retain her focus, she made direct eye contact with the Queen, the unofficial leader of the 5 family heads. "It is only out of filial pity that we are even meeting. A lot of the members from the council wanted to directly wait for you with gravedigger formations back on Earth and finish you off once and for all." The family heads suddenly grimaced when they heard those words. Gravedigger formations were the nuclear deterrents of the cultivation world. It was a hassle to set one up, simply because of the resources required to actually make one, but they had no theoretical upper power limit. If used properly, and if they were caught unaware, those formations could be a real threat to them. "Hey, don't forget about Sam Jr. who wanted to use hydrogen bombs," pitched in Kevin. Miranda gave Kevin a dirty look, but continued, "Yes, many ways of disposing of you were discussed. You should be thankful that in the end the council only decided to imprison you at the inn." "Hey, I can think of a few ways to thank you," said Brandon with a wink. Without missing a beat, Audrey stabbed Brandon in the leg with a small dagger, completely unconcerned that the innkeeper would consider it an attack. As if to emphasize to her husband to behave, she looked towards the 2 men sitting beside Miranda and said, "I'm considering taking concubines. Would you be interested?" Back in his room, Lex felt like flipping a table. This was supposed to be a serious meeting. What the hell was going on? Chapter 159 Oppressed Cultivators. As annoyed as Lex was by the 2 senior Morrisons, he noticed that neither the family heads nor the other 3 responded to them. It was as if years of experience had taught them the best way to handle them was to ignore them. The strong blush running down Miranda's neck was completely not a giveaway about how she felt about Brandon's flirting, not at all. "Do you really expect this to work?" Richard asked. "You cannot trap us here. We can leave, and even if you do bomb 2 cities, or even more, as long as we return to Earth, all of you will die." "Do not try to bluff, old man," Lee said, yawning. He was not at all intimidated by these few who had controlled Earth for so long. "You bend over backwards to stop any cultivator conflict, and step in even if a mortal conflict is getting too big. You think you are being secretive, but the truth is, old-timer, other than your cultivation, you are not superior in anything else. The same goes for the rest of you as well." Lee gave a derisive look to all in the room. "You are not good leaders. You are not good businessmen. You are not good politicians. You make yourselves feel good by saying you're protecting people's lives, but all you're doing is suppressing your own people. Your shoddy rules and improper management are literally destroying Earth, but the mortals are protected from the truth, so who cares?" At the end of his little triad, Lee got a little heated, no doubt from holding in years of resentment, but decided to stop so Miranda would not pester him. But just as she was about to speak again, he discovered that he really could not stop himself. "You're uneducated and stuck in bygone traditions. You trained your descendants to be the best, but then forced them to hide and suppress themselves. You taught them to have ambition and then buried it with your own hands. It is not betrayal when you betrayed us first. You—" "Lee, stop," interrupted Kevin. "Go take a breather. We'll handle this." Lee realized that he had, indeed, lost his temper. It really was better to go cool off. They still had many things to take care of after this. He gave Richard a dirty look and said one last thing before leaving. "As much as you all look down on him, at least Brandon gave his descendants a place to thrive. Of all the families, his has the least members on the Council of the New Order." At this, Brandon and Audrey both raised an eyebrow. Council of the New Order is probably what they called themselves, but what truly attracted him was the part about the least members. Least did not mean none. So even the Morrison family had traitors. With Lee leaving the room, Miranda took a deep breath and turned back to the Queen. "We have much to do, so I'm not going to waste any more time. We did not come here to negotiate, we only came here to tell what's going to happen from now on. You can choose how to react to this information, but the consequences will be your own. You can believe us about the nuclear bombs or you can test it out, it'll be up to you. The mortals have ruled and the cultivators have hid long enough. It's time to restore proper order, for both their sakes and ours. Soon, the borders of many countries will change. Sects will once again openly recruit and cultivators will take over positions of power. All efforts will be put towards the growth and expansion of the cultivation civilization. As for you, you will remain at the inn until a time that the council decides you may return. Don't worry, treat it like retirement. Play bingo, watch some TV, whatever it is retired people do. Because, even if you do come back, you'll find that your influence is gone. No one will listen to you. Any authority you thought you had was only because none of the council members wanted to fight you up front. Anyone who was still loyal to you, well, let's not get into the specifics. Is it so easy for you to massacre so many people? The queen asked in an even voice. If she was feeling anger or frustration, it was not evident. Miranda looked at the queen placidly, as if she had asked the stupidest question in the world. About as easy as it was for you to let my father die. I think I've heard about enough, Brandon said, standing up, a dagger still sticking out of his leg. Little girl, I wish you the best in your endeavors. I never cared much for ruling Earth anyway, too much responsibility, I would rather chill at the beach with my wife. I will only give you one piece of advice, don't kill too many people during your little revolution. If you piss off the boss lady, you might really learn just about how much power you really have. Oh and I'll stay at the inn, but someone uses that as an excuse to harm my kids or grandkids. He didn't finish his sentence as he left the room, but his message was clear. Miranda let out a little sigh, even as she swooned a little internally. Their biggest concern really was the Morrison family. Although mostly focused on Mars, their army was sizable. Naturally, against all the cultivators of Earth it was still inferior in strength, but the damage the council would take fighting them would be considerable. Are you sure about this? Audrey asked as the old, but somehow very young-looking, couple walked away. You know I never cared much for the responsibility. If Rorik or the others want to do something about it, they can, but I say good riddance. Keeping that woman happy was too annoying. Now we can just focus on what we want to do. Hey Barry, want to have another kid? Audrey smacked the man on the back of his head, effectively communicating her feelings about that notion, as they continued to stroll around. They had many hours before the next match. Alexander was sleeping, recovering from the mental exhaustion, and Rorik was cultivating in his room, completely unaware of what was happening in the outside world. While the Morrisons strode off, Lex was still focused on the meeting. The family heads learned of how deeply the betrayal ran, and they all had mixed feelings. Basically, anyone not from their immediate family was very dissatisfied with them, to put it mildly. They were born at the peak of the world, raised to be the best, then suppressed and forced to hide their brilliance so that the mortal world would not be destabilized. Lex honestly didn't care about any of that, and currently he had no thoughts on what the family heads could have done better. He was slowly getting agitated by not being able to learn any specific details about Earth. A part of him wanted to simply return to New York and see if he could call his family. But of course, he knew that all communication had been shut down, so he would learn nothing. Eventually, he decided to wait one more day to see if someone would answer his commission, or else he would start to take more drastic measures. Somewhere in the universe, far away, Serene Williams was looking at her husband as he practiced. On her face she wore expressions of both disappointment and annoyance, but the man did not notice as he was focused on his sword. He was practicing shirtless, his taut muscles rippling with each move, his rolling sweat giving his body a nice sheen. His each swing was slow and deliberate, but despite that each time he finished a swing the very room would tremble. The man frowned, he still could not prevent energy from leaking. When he was able to perform each move without any sound or wind, without any energy leaking at all, he would finally reach a satisfactory level of mastery. Finally, unable to wait for him to notice her, Serene said, "There's news from Earth." "Oh, did the kid finally do something interesting?" Serene gave her husband an exasperated look. "He's only just started cultivating, what can he even do?" "No, this is more serious. Cultivators have revolted against the proctors we assigned to keep the peace, war has erupted." This attracted the man's attention, and he finally stopped practicing and turned towards his wife, wearing a look of, "I told you so." Even that isn't the serious part. When I heard about the war, I had the local sentries call back all the guests we've sent on Earth for their own protection. They're all there, except... Serene paused, and despite her usual composure, wore a look of exasperation. "No one can get in touch with Batet. She has left the planet." The man was startled, but the look of horror quickly changed to that of great amusement. He burst out laughing, his energy causing an earthquake on the continent where they were. Chapter 160 Panic. "Stop laughing," Serene said, but the chiseled man only roared out harder. The room was shaking and paintings had started falling off the walls, but he could not care less. "Stop laughing," she said again, feeling slightly embarrassed, but to no avail. Finally, her expression turned serious, and she said in a bitingly cold voice, "Stop laughing." As if he had been faking it all this time, the man went from almost falling over to a modest smirk. Seeing that he had listened, her expression softened and continued, "What are we going to do about this? How did she escape? Do you have any clues? I strongly suspect the newly discovered entity known as Midnight Inn may have played a role." Although Earth isn't a dead zone, lacking higher forms of spiritual energy and making it the perfect place for high-level political prisoners, if they can travel to the Midnight Inn and recuperate their energy, escaping becomes an option. Oh please, how many of those prisoners can travel directly in space or teleport? We don't need to do anything. Earth can continue to serve as a prison, just no longer for anyone approaching the Downlord realm. Send a report back to the family, there's no need to hide the matter. If they want to pick an issue, they can go find the Midnight Inn, I don't care. With that, the matter was resolved, and the man returned to his practice. Serene sighed as she opened a tablet to write up her report. She completely ignored a small notification in the corner with the title, "Your daughter has run away from school again." She could only handle one disaster at a time. Slowly the hours passed and many things happened at the inn. The meeting between the family heads and the representatives of the council did not go over well and, as Lex predicted, his guards had to get involved. Still, none of the family heads returned to Earth. They only sent back their assistants and followers and tried to control the situation through them. Unfortunately, it seemed that they truly had lost all authority. The few who were still willing to follow the command of the family heads were locked in battle with the council's forces. Most countries worldwide were already under their control. Strangely enough, only South Korea and Japan were able to resist the influence of the council. As for why that was, the family heads were receiving only bits and pieces of information, so it could not yet be determined. In the meantime, the armies were preparing for their next match. The recovery afforded to them in their bases was remarkable and almost all were fully healed. Only a few who had extremely serious injuries had to preemptively forfeit. About 900 of Alexander's soldiers were still capable of fighting. While most of them were resting, a few of them were submitting a report for new supplies and gear to be brought from Mars. While this was happening, they received a dossier from the Jotun army. Considering Earth's stellar performance, Anthony decided to give them more support so long as they continued to deliver at the same level. In the dossier was information about the terrain for the remaining 9 nodes. Since the node's location had been identified back on the planet, they quickly drew up maps based on previous satellite images and marked down the terrain and notable landmarks. They could not predict where the next game would be, but at least they would not be surprised no matter what they faced. This was extremely important because 2 of the nodes were underwater. Without proper gear, the soldiers would literally drown and die within the first hour. In the dossier was also a report on Pramod. The Empire could not confirm it just from watching him fight Alexander, but they had strong suspicions about his species. They suspected he was a nightmare demon. This was a very rare, very dangerous breed of demons that was named not because of how they originated, but because they were a nightmare for anyone to face. The document gave a lot of details on how to properly fight a nightmare demon, but to spare everyone the issue of figuring out how to apply this information, they also provided a spiritual technique that could actually damage them. It was not very strong, but at least it did more harm than Alexander's attacks did, and at a fraction of the energy cost. Like this, the calm was kept right up until a few hours before the next match. So far, most of the guests at the inn from Earth didn't actually know what was happening. But as if planned, several panicked guests entered the inn at the same time. They tripped and tumbled as they ran towards those they knew. Unable to be discreet in their mental condition, they shouted war when they finally saw their compatriots. In but a few minutes, news spread. The guests that arrived didn't know the global situation, but when enough of them got together and told similar stories, it became apparent that the issue was widespread. Fortunately, it seemed that so far cities were being occupied and put under martial law, and there were no reports of widespread massacres. But the lack of information and abundance of over-imagination caused panic. At this point, despite his own agitated state, Lex had to intervene. Honestly, he was feeling a little annoyed at the family heads for not addressing the people from Earth who were at the inn, but it didn't matter. They were caught up in their own world. "Please, be calm," a warm yet firm voice washed over the citizens of Earth. Somehow, Lex had figured out how to give targeted announcements, so only Earthlings were hearing his voice right now. From Ragnar, who was cultivating, to those who were asleep, to Sophia, who had not left her son's side, they all heard the voice. "It appears that your planet has come under conflict. Such a time of difficulty is dreaded by all, but as citizens of your planet, it is also your responsibility to shape the destiny of your planet. But at the same time, how can you fearlessly face the future if you are concerned for your loved ones? For the people of Earth, the Midnight Inn will offer great discounts to provide you and your loved ones safety and security, so long as the conflict remains. Please, if you think you or yours are in danger, do not hesitate to bring them to the inn." The announcement was short and direct, and delivered the message well enough. Immediately, most of them realized the security and safety the inn could provide and started returning to Earth to fetch their families. The 100 students from Troy Academy felt scared, but surprisingly handled the information better than most adults. It made sense, their regular lives weren't exactly normal either. Actually, it suddenly occurred to Lex that some of them might be kids of the people leading this worldwide revolution, which is exactly why they were sent here, for the security, or to be spies. As much as Lex hated the feeling that he was simply doing this to fulfill the refugee quest, the truth was that he genuinely wasn't. Previously, he was so concerned about his own family that he forgot about the quest. But the fact that he remembered now was good enough. One thing he might need to address later was housing for the refugees if the conflict lasted longer than the Midnight Games. For now, there was temporary housing due to the event panel, but once the event ended, that would go away. It seemed like he needed to save more MP, just in case. It was at this time he also thought of his friends in New York. The fact that he couldn't reach his family was one matter, but those in New York were still within reach. Lex was not indecisive at all this time around. Deep down, he felt like maybe he was just looking for an excuse to not be logical and just return to Earth. But if an excuse was what he needed, his friend's safety gave him just that. He had to at least check on them. After all, as odd as it may be, despite their short time knowing each other, Lex thought of Larry as a good friend. He returned to his room and donned the damaged armor he'd bought before going to Nibiru last time, and wore a hoodie on top of it. He ensured the safety was on before hiding the heavy Harley in the back of his pants like in the movies. As uncomfortable as it was, he dealt with it. Making sure he had all the items he needed one last time, he was ready. The next game would start in a few hours, he should be back by then, but if he weren't he told Mary to start without him. With that, he disappeared from his room and returned to Earth.